for Conversations for the Future. My name is Nara Tabir, and I want to say hello to everyone out there on Zoom and all of our live streaming platforms. We're coming to you with Foundation for the Future today, and we have an amazing guest. I'm very excited to introduce Michael Mansky. He is an innovation and invention guru. He is the president and CEO of Global Data Sciences and the innovation director for the Multiplanetary Society. Good morning, Mike.
Well, good morning, and good morning, everybody. Oh, what a day.
Absolutely. So today we're talking about something I think has not been covered, especially in the spacer world, enough, and that is global supply chain and how that is going to affect us going forward and how it's going to affect us in space specifically.
Okay. Just a little bit about my background is I've been in industry for decades. And my company, Global Data Sciences, actually, we are a global consulting firm. We work in the manufacturing and the supply chain space. And in fact, we support businesses on every continent except Antarctica. I'm pushing for that one, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. But as we all know, supply chain is still making the news today, based on coming out of COVID and some of the issues that we're still facing in reference to materials not getting to where they need to be and so forth. And in addition to that, if we look at the some of the news today that's come forth, there's some issues with the railroads now that are threatening another disruption with supply chain. And I've heard that possibly there's an agreement in place to take care of that. But I don't think that anybody was quite prepared for what happened when COVID hit.
Are we even prepared now? I mean, honestly, I never thought about supply chain. I don't know, I'm sure you did, but I just took it for granted that things would get to me on time at the places I wanted them to be at. And it was all kind of this magic behind the scenes thing. I think even now, when we should know better, most people still aren't really thinking about how that all happens.
And they're still not. And the the scary thing about it is what just happened with COVID was predicted quite a long time ago. And I won't dive too deep into that, but the threats were there from a disruption perspective and the need for a plan B, if you will. And that didn't exist. And so, with COVID and the aftermath and the fact that there's still materials either unaccounted for or stuck somewhere that can't get into the into the ports and so forth, those issues are still going on. It's kind of dropped off the news somewhat, but what a lot of people don't realize is we could be facing yet another round of that, and nothing's been really done to kind of clean up the process. Everybody's still in the reactionary mode where, oh my God, I have to get my cargo container from point A to point B. That's great. Okay. But, what do you do to safeguard your business as well as, the livelihood of those that, work for you or you're working with and so forth. And so, again, a plan B is something that we really need here on Earth, but more importantly, and this is relevant to where we're headed in space, okay, over the next decades, how are we going to manage that? There's a scenario that I've used in discussions before with, if you've got a mining complex on the moon, and suddenly you have to go to your miners and tell them that, hey, coffee's been delayed now for 3 months, as well as Oreo cookies. I think you could imagine the frustration everybody's going to have. And the lesson learned from COVID, okay, really needs to be taken seriously, because there's a few critical things that face us as we move off world. Okay, the first one is sustainability, and with that comes redundancy. Okay, we need a plan A, a plan B, and probably a plan C, depending on where we're going to be going. Okay, the sustainability component of that factors into it as well, but there's also the commerce piece, and that's something that is still being debated. Okay, how are we going to pay for materials? How are we going to pay for transportation? How are we going to pay for warehousing? Where are those places going to be? And as we sit back and we look at it, these are critical things that we need to be thinking about and plugging into the equations at the right time. One of the things that, if we come back and we look at what just happened with COVID, okay, I'll just openly say this. A lot of C-suite executives really didn't consider the fact that they were facing what actually occurred. Most executives, a lot of it is, about, making sure they've sustained, cash flow and, from an accounting perspective, all those things are lined up. But, at the end of the day, the disruption component was never factored in. And we saw that here on Earth with in the States with toilet paper shortage and so forth. Okay.
I think that's really become the symbol of our duration of COVID is, the toilet paper stocking up. I've heard you talk about this before, and you are not a fan of the shoring up idea of just like patching holes in the supply chain issues. You would like to see a complete reset globally, right?
Right. Absolutely. And we need one. It's time to kind of step back and rethink the foundational thinking. Okay. And what is, as the global economy does continue to grow. Okay. And certainly the technology is available to make a lot of these things work better, but trying to get everybody on the same page is a critical component. Now, one of the things that I stress to my folks that because we work on multiple continents is we can never assume similarity ever. Okay, so when you're working with a culture here or there, or even here in the good old USA, okay, you can never assume that the businesses you're dealing with or the culture that you're dealing with looks at things the same way you do. Okay, and it's really important to kind of step in, assess that, and make sure that pardon the pun, you're speaking the same language when it comes to business as well as moving materials and so forth. And that's that's up to us to make sure that we're on the same page. Because
so do we have a path forward on that? I mean, when it comes to business, one of the key aspects of business is that you're able to get ahead of your competition by having proprietary systems. But are we seeing kind of the failure of proprietary systems when it comes to supply chain?
Yes, we are. And in addition to that, when it comes to supply chain in particular, so I'll use this as an example. Again, the technology exists to do this correctly, but depending on the size of the company that you're dealing with or the politics within a business or whatever, a lot of people, and we experience this ourselves, they tap on the shoulder of IT and say, okay, IT, this is your problem. We can't get our orders through. This is your problem. It's not information technology's problem. It's a business issue. And what happens is a lot of times within the sales process, as well as technology and even with IT, those functions are treated more like utility, okay, as opposed to a critical business function. So that the folks, some in the C-suite just, hey, you know what? I got to see the flow of the dough, if you will, coming in. Okay, I don't really care whether or not we have this problem or that problem that needs to happen. What happened with COVID, though, is if you take a look at the number of companies that all of a sudden had to force work from home. All right, so if you had a staff of 100 people, and all of a sudden you say, okay, everybody's got to work from home. Well, you're going to eliminate some of that staff because, in an office complex and so forth, there's certain roles you don't need. Okay. And then maybe you reduce your staff down to, say, 35%. Okay. So 35% of your people now all of a sudden have to work from home. What was encountered was a lot of people couldn't do that. It just wasn't in their thinking or process or whatever. Okay. So now you're down to a much smaller group of people who were expected to pick up the ball and run with it. And some could, others could not. And that's where you saw a lot of the disruption occurring. And
it really is the people, right? I mean, this is where we have a lot of failures across any system, is the ability for a human being to pivot and do things that aren't the usual for them.
That is correct. And so one of the areas and I won't dive too deep into the nerd piece of this, but one of the areas that we do a lot of work in is in machine learning. Okay. And there's a fundamental question that I love to ask people when they start, throwing technology my way, and, the phrases and so forth is, and, yeah, Anara, this is a question for you. Okay.
All right.
Who are the machines?
Okay, so I'm a consummate Cylon, so I'm going to say it's definitely us.
No, but that is the case. Okay. I mean, at the end of the day, we are the machines. Okay. And we're the ones that actually need to understand the processes and so forth. And, come back and make sure that, everything is flowing correctly, that we know where our materials are at and so forth. Now, we can train systems to actually sustain those functions. We can, but it actually starts at the human level. We have to think of it that way, as opposed to grabbing the next greatest and best thing and trying to plug it into your company. If you don't understand the process of your business and how things are going to work, that's going to be an issue. So moving forward, okay, as now this is where I see a really awesome opportunity. As we move forward and humanity starts to explore the rest of our solar system, as well as moving beyond that, all right, we have an opportunity to kind of step back and go, you know what, we know what processes don't work. All right, let's engineer some that do.
That could be the advantage right now. I mean, right now, I think we have a very hard road ahead of us. When you're talking about, for instance, updating the electrical grids of a country, that doesn't happen because it's so much money and human ability that has to be leveraged to completely remove everything and start over. So people are constantly just trying to integrate new systems into old systems. So the fact that we need to completely overhaul the global supply chain, I don't think it's going to be a very easy road. But as we're doing that, I think we can, in the space industry, especially with organizations like Foundation for the Future, which is looking at more like foundational and infrastructural platforms, we can take notes and we can build a global, or rather a cislunar supply chain that operates much more efficiently, and that we can modularly fix, upgrade, integrate.
Absolutely. And the technology, a lot of it does exist to do that. Okay. And granted, there's some pretty neat stuff coming along, but at the end of the day, we have to get everybody on the same page. And that is, to me, that's the critical part. Okay. There have been a lot of successes, and I don't want to ever dismiss that, but there's been a lot of failures too. Okay. And there's some great entrepreneurs involved in space. Okay. And some of them do really get it. They do. Okay. Others do not. Others are still kind of stuck in that traditional mode. And I won't mention names, of course, but it's if you do your research and so forth, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But we have the ability to take that and just use what we've learned, understand the mistakes that have been made. Can we change things here on Earth? I hope so. We're going to need to, because there'll be another crisis coming. And, it's just a matter of time. Could be a year from now, could be 10 years from now, but it's coming. And if we don't learn from what just happened with COVID, we're going to fail. And I mean, that's kind of that. So, but
I mean, COVID was a soft hit, really. If you think about it, as terrible as it was, there are so many other existential threats that we could endure that could have, really collapsed. Because, I mean, we had to go without some of our favorite products. Things ran out, but they were restocked eventually. I mean, all in all, from what I saw in most countries, it wasn't catastrophic as far as supply went. It just wasn't very comfortable. I mean, we could have been hit with something much worse, or maybe a compound of several, war issues or viruses, or, all different kinds of issues at once. We kind of got lucky. So maybe this is a wake-up call. We should really, really invest in changing things at this point.
Yeah. And I mean, it's back to my, the term I've used, it's foundational thinking. Okay. It's, it is time for a reset. Okay. And, maybe we call this the next industrial revolution, or what we have to do to get it moving. Now, what I do like is I have encountered a lot of people, okay, that are thinking that way, which is great. All right. And some of them really know what they want to do and what and how to do it. Okay, others are learning. There are some that are along for the ride, if you will. Okay, but I think that again, we have this opportunity, and we need to really take advantage of it, because, all right, if we're supposed to have coffee on the moon by 2035, and we can't because the coffee beans got either hijacked, or they're sitting in a storage closet somewhere and nobody can find them. Okay, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's how wars begin, Mike, honestly. Like, if I'm not gonna get my coffee, then it's a whole different civilization we're talking about. So give me a glimpse into the future. If we are going to have this reset, and we're going to play a better game and integrate systems, Jerry O'Neill says in his book 2081 that technology creates culture. So we see this, not the other way around. We see this with the Industrial Revolution. You referenced that. With the Industrial Revolution, we saw this migration of humanity from mostly rural living to mostly city living. It changed every aspect of how things work, from the size of the family to family relations, how we spend holidays, how we prioritize our spending in general, what we go after, all these different things, just on one element, which was automation. I mean, automation was this magical element that shifted everything. When we're talking about really creating a system of global supply chain and then cislunar supply chain that can endure what we're trying to build, what is it? How does it change us? What does our future look like? How is it different?
Well, I can look at it from the perspective, if we don't, okay, we don't do anything, all right. And technology is an interesting play too, okay, because when you look at we look at the last 20 years, and one of the things that surprises me is you go to a restaurant nowadays, okay, and everybody's on their phones, or kids are on their tablets and so forth. So culturally, based on the evolution of technology and so forth, everything is moving along, okay, kind of like it did with the Industrial Revolution. There are costs to that, okay, because culturally we have to be able to understand, again, how those technologies are going to influence everyone. Okay, that's a tough call. Now, the one thing that I do want to stress is, and this is really important, we can tell people what they want to hear. All right, and that seems to, in the corporate world, that does thrive. Okay, people, they're going to go in and they're going to tell their executive teams what they want to hear, because they feel that that's job security. All right. We need to be able to tell people what they need to hear. Now, whether or not they want to listen and how we manage that, that's a whole different story.
So are we in that critical moment where those who embrace this need and this reset are the ones that flourish and the other ones drop off? Are we going to see chaos where both sides try to contend? I really want to know, are we going to see more global cooperation during this reset, to where we do create more of a global basis for supply chain, regardless of our different, political or military alliances? Or is it going to be like islands of alliances where supply chain is secured if your political and military aspects are aligned?
I would agree. I think that the last scenario you described, because it would take again, all the cultures are different. Okay, yes, everybody was impacted by COVID. Okay, yes, supply chain is an issue, but trying to get everybody to, again, normalize a critical component and actually bring everyone together and make them understand that's going to be a tough call. And that's why space, back to that, all right, as we develop that culture, we kind of need to start at the foundation and just make sure that we get everybody to understand where we're headed. Now, granted, we move into space, there's going to be different cultural groups and so forth and so on we're going to have to manage, but we need to put the root components in place to make sure that we've got everything covered. Learn from the lessons. We just
Well, I think if your docking port isn't compatible with somebody's docking lock, these kind of things, you can't really work together. You'd have to augment your technology to have new alliances. And so maybe we do need some sort of international body that unifies these objects or these critical components, kind of like a universal plug. I mean, I travel all over and I'm having to constantly get new plugs for everything that I'm using, depending on what country I land in, and it's obnoxious. But when we're in space, that could be the difference between life and death. So I think it's really important that we get this figured out now. I would love to see, and I think it's going to happen, the rise of an industry, an entire industry around creating the supply chain standards for space. Foundation for the Future is looking at this day when we have real infrastructure in space that allows us to have a space industry. Because I think right now we don't have a space industry. We have a terrestrial industry or a group of them that's looking towards space, but they can't really operate in a large way in space. So once we do get there and on the way there, we could form an entire industry around just the supply chain aspect of getting there and working there.
Yep. And that goes to sustainability. Okay. Just making sure that, everything is cohesive and well coupled. All right. And I also want to say is, okay, here on Earth, we're not a lost cause. Okay, at all. It's just trying to make sure that we get, the machines, if you will, the people, okay, to understand that there are components within, the thought process that are critical to get your toilet paper at the right time.
Absolutely. I'm pretty sure there's been a lot of these kind of conversations up at the International Space Station. There's only so much up there, and who knows whether you're going to get the next supply run. I mean, I would be thinking about it a lot more. Trains are a good example of that. I think when the train doesn't arrive on time, suddenly we're like, why doesn't the system work? We start questioning it, but hopefully we can get ahead of it. So I would love to take some questions from all of you out there listening on our live streaming platforms or here in Zoom with us. So go ahead and text those to us and we'd be happy to ask Mike for you. And April, are we taking live questions over video? Great. So if anyone here in the Zoom chat would like to ask Mike a question directly, just raise your hand and I'm happy to open your mic. Okay, so Rebecca Shembri asks, what is the most important step right now for this? Rebecca, do you mean in the sense of where do we start?
Yes. So this is it's terrifying to see how much we depend on the supply chains and on everything that that's going on. So our motives are what we want is to get to space and to continue moving towards space. So what do we need to do right now, Michael, in your opinion? Where's our weakest point right now that we should really focus our energy on? And thank you for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. I would say that where we need to start is we need to develop a common methodology in reference to supply chain in space where we could bring the right core people together, okay, with, some thoughts and ideas and so forth, and really begin to roll out a couple of projects, some basic platforms, if you will, that would guide the process. But we need to be open to the fact that aspects of the process may need to change as we begin to develop it.
So as a follow-up, what do you see the hindrance to this process? Like, what is the biggest hurdle that you see at this moment to get the global system to cooperate?
Okay. Getting everybody on the same page. That's a tough one. And what I would do is, by the way, the technology exists to do everything that we need to do today. And there's more coming, which is great. And I'm not opposed to being a techie. I'm not opposed to that at all. Okay. But really trying to get everybody on the same page and create a foundation of, people that understand the need, understand the critical aspects of it, the potential of failure, but more importantly, okay, the true need for success, because it is doable. Everything we've talked about here can be done. Okay. It's just making sure that, we oh God, I'll use this term. We bring the forces together, not to be confused with the force. Okay. but we need to do that. Yeah.
So I guess helping the global system of business understand that while it's good to have advantages over your rivals and it's good to have these proprietary systems to get that edge, which is very important to the market, there has to be some sort of neutral basic foundation that we can all adhere to and not really play advantages over. I think that might be hard because
Yes.
for every 9, organisms or industries that are willing to play that game and have that neutral foundation, maybe one goes, okay, that's my N. So maybe we need to have some sort of international understanding or gathering or business philosophy that makes it off limits somehow, so that we can ensure that that is a basic that isn't leveraged against others.
Right. And it's that's going to be it's interesting because there's a communications mechanism called the electronic data interchange, okay, which are standards that are used to, and I'm using this as a data nerd thing, okay, but that's how orders are placed, okay, between suppliers and businesses. Okay, so the way that you do business with the large big box stores here in the States. Okay, domestically there's a standard called X12. Okay, and that is the communication standard that everybody uses to pass everything from orders to invoices and so forth back and forth. Right. Europe and a lot of other countries use something called EDIFACT. That's their standard. Now, the European Union forces everybody to follow exactly that standard, which I think is great. Okay. The X12 standard, which is not only US, but it's other countries as well. People use that as a suggestion, pretty much. Okay. Now, I know that sounds weird. Okay. But, our good friends at one big box company may want to use that standard a little bit differently than somebody at another one. Okay. And it causes a lot of confusion and it causes a lot of disruption. Trying to get everybody on the same page with that is difficult. And, it's, again, we've seen that as a problem with supply chain as well, where orders get lost or invoices don't get paid, for example, that sort of thing, right? Because yes, there's a standard out there, but nobody seems to want to follow it. Okay. They have their own idea at the corporate level about how things should be done. That mentality needs to change because, at the end of the day, okay, order to cash is critical. Absolutely. Okay. But the moment that you decide you're going to change your process, and once you do that, there's a trickle down effect that impacts your suppliers and impacts, shipping and so forth and so on. That's a problem, an easily solved one. But everybody has to acknowledge the fact that, yes, there's a standard. We must follow that. And
so basically the big dog can impact the little dogs, and really you have no choice there. I think going out, when we're talking about space, we're talking about cislunar economy. When we start really having settlements on the moon and we have a supply chain running, that's going to be a target for other organisms, other countries, other priorities out there. That supply chain will be the easiest thing to hit to destabilize a civilization starting on the moon.
right.
So, another part of this we're going to have to look at when we talk about market. The market is its own creature. In many ways, it's out of the control of people that are, within that market. But if we're mission oriented, I think that's where we can change the game. We go from market orientation to mission orientation with an organization like Space Force, for instance, that is tasked with securing the supply chain. Then we have a lot more flexibility and a lot more methods we can employ. We have a question. So Sean, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of very much in the same line. There's, you mentioned earlier, Mike, that we have the technology. We'll get more technology to be able to achieve these things. And certainly, to your point around mission, we seem to have the ability, but we lack the will to, collaboratively work on this stuff. So, do you have any kind of thoughts on how we can start to create that, global willpower to start to invest in building these sustainable supply chains and moving forward?
I think what we need to do collectively is find a way to put our best foot forward and say, this is how it needs to be done. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to get some large players to work with us on that because, just as humans, if you will, okay, consumers, nobody's going to listen to that. Okay. Unless we create an entity, if you will, that is going to force people to be responsible. And that's going to be tough, but it does need to be done. When I look at, we recently had a client that, and this is very typical. Okay. They had made the decision to change over their internal IT system to something brand new, which needed to be done. That was a great idea. But in parallel with that, they also changed their mechanism for handling supply chain. And it was a disaster waiting to happen. Okay, because so many internal to that business, so many political factions, if you will, internally, okay, had their own ideas, had their own concepts, and so forth. And at the end of the day, they took a project that actually should have been a pretty simple one, okay, and really turned it into something that it was just a lot of mayhem. All right, we have the opportunity to take all those things that we learn and just come back and go, okay, this is really how it must be done. Okay. And maybe that's the key. As we build that foundation, we say, this is how it must be done. And again, trying to find the right people to back us up on that, that will be the challenge.
I think we have it here. Rebecca says it right in the chat, and I have to agree with her. Foundation for the Future is well placed to be that voice and to be that pressure system that we need. So they've already got an amazing record dealing with Capitol Hill, and I think they can really bring that to Congress for us. So Mike, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. My name is Inara Tabir. You can find me across all socials as Galaxis Gal. And next up, we have Rob Gabbard.
Thanks, Inara. And very interesting, Michael. I'm Rob Gabbard. I'm a government affairs consultant and director of Space PAC, which is a political action committee that helps kind of educate members of Congress about the space industry, and not ones that are on space committees that already kind of know about space. We want to educate the people that don't know about it, like the Ways and Means Committee, like tax committees. Now, if we're really going to be an industry, industries don't come to Capitol Hill to talk about their technologies. They come to talk about taxes and workforce and insurance, boring things. And so I'm trying to fill that little gap there. And it's been pretty effective so far. A lot of members had no idea that they had people living and working, welding stuff in Kentucky for the space industry. Right now, I'm on Capitol Hill and just had a lot of meetings with members, but I'm here with the Kentucky Association of Manufacturers. I represent their aerospace council. We export like $15 billion of aerospace products, including structural steel for Starship and the parachutes for Blue Origin that came in handy recently. And there's this, so I'm really trying to tell those stories of the manufacturing base that makes up the space community to really just humanize us and bring it back. Space is we all love it and we're geeks about it, but it's a hard leap for most people to make if they're not inclined that way. And they think about science projects or a billionaire thing. And that's just like completely the wrong message. It's a human business terrestrially. And, that's the message I'm trying to do with the PAC. But this week has been very interesting. I was with the Hudson Institute, it's a large think tank here in DC, and I'm helping them stand up their space policy division. And I had the chance to moderate a panel. We had former Administrator Bridenstine, we had Undersecretary of Defense there, and we had Defense Innovation Units, kind of a state of the space industrial base East, DC, more focused on, okay, yeah, we need a North Star vision and all this, but how do we get the people to actually do all this stuff? Like, we have the technology, we have the money, but we don't have all the people to work, and people don't know that they can work in the space industry. And so I hosted a panel on international cooperation with a person from JAXA, and then Michael Mealing, who's a venture capitalist, Starbridge Capital. He was a co-founder of Maston, and then Jeffrey Manbar of NanoRacks, now Voyager, and then Christian Jur, who used to run the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Space Policy Division for many years, and now he's running the Commercial Space Institute with Kevin O'Connell. But a lot of this supply chain, like who are our partners? The world is changing. The U.S. stopped policing the world, as they say, and the Russia conflict has really shown that, whoa, we aren't as robust as we think we are, and our supply chains are all messed up. And so, who are our actual new partners? And I think space is the best way to figure that out. Who's going to be in our global realm of partners? And you saw with the F-35, they had to ground those because they were getting these magnets from China, and that was a national security risk. We have so much trouble we have no rare earth elements, barely. China owns almost all those. So it's a big challenge. And who are going to be I suggested that, what if we created an alliance terrestrially, on supply chain, if we're a partner and on Earth, and that could be a part of that could help solve ITAR problems. Okay, if you're in this partnership, then maybe we can share information rights. All the information rights people speak different languages, so it's a big challenge to even figure out who's on our side. There's a lot of Chinese money infiltrating venture-backed startups. I have had the experience of this firsthand. I was helping a company raise money, and there's a VC firm that looked very whatever, they're fine, and they offered money and started doing some due diligence. We were pretty cautious about where we're taking money from, and you Google that they've got a Cayman Island entity, and then you trace that back. I actually have a friend at the FBI who I sent their information to. He's like, yeah, don't do that. They're directly linked to the Communist Chinese Party, and it's a pretty interesting thing. And with the Trans-Pacific Partnership kind of blowing up, you got an East Coast or East trade and a Western trade alliance, and we haven't figured it out. And these manufacturers here today, they're very concerned about it because they can't get iron and steel for their foundries. Like we get so advanced, we're thinking about all this stuff in space, but we're having a real hard time with the simple things that make our way of life go right now, and that's very concerning.
We get too comfortable. That's my question for you. So I think, in the early age of space, we were very mission oriented. The American government and the American people were very mission oriented. And I think somewhere along the line, we became more market dominated. So business started dictating our political and military policies. And I think we got very, very comfortable. I don't think it's really a coincidence that during the height of the Cold War, we had the best output when it came to space. Kennedy stood up there and said, Kennedy didn't say, it'd be nice if we did this. It would be great if we could achieve this. He said, we're going to do this. And there was that drive. And I think everyone in the nation felt it. We felt this heroic myth that we were all creating together. And somewhere along the line in the 80s, things started calming down and the Cold War started dying down and we all became friends. And then we kind of started hitching rides to space. So, I don't think it's a coincidence that now we see this pressure with Russia really breaking ranks with the international community. And suddenly space is a big buzzword on Capitol Hill and now a priority again. Are we going to see a larger transition away from the market dominating our political and military policy? Are we going to get back to that mission orientation?
I think so. And I think we need it as a nation. We've just been so divided on the most critical, silly issues, in my opinion. We're not in Syria, guys. We have really good lifestyles compared to 99.9% of the world. Bridenstine, SLS gets a lot of flack, and rightly so, but Bridenstine kind of protected it a little bit as, that's our national statement. It's not because it's the business case closes. It's because we needed Artemis for a way to bring in partners. So if you want to participate in Artemis, and you're going to have to sign these accords, which gets us to a little bit standard of norms, but it's still not that giant call to action that I think the country really needs. And the Cold War competition is really good for America. It brings out the best in us as long as we can keep it at competition and not conflict. I think Cold Wars are great. And now it's pretty openly said that we're in a Cold War with China. And I think that's a bipartisan issue that everyone understands and is very concerned about. And it's I think it's good. So I'm hopeful that this conflict will bring out the best in us. We're going to reshore a lot of manufacturing. It's going to be inflationary, though. It's going to cost a lot more to live in America. And I just recently had a baby, and my wife gets her new things all the time. We get 5 packages every day almost, it seems like,
You and Amazon are sharing that household, right?
just a click of a button, and then you got all these goods, and they're mostly from from China, and it's we have it very good. I think we're going to have a little more glass to chew on for the next little bit. We're not going to be as comfortable, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think having conflict and stress is good for people in general, and that's why you push yourself to do hard things. And we've got to start doing these bold things again. I'm hoping that one of the things that came up is Russia's been threatening to exit the International Space Station, and that's basically the propulsion module that holds it in orbit. We don't know if they're going to twist out and do something that messes things up, or they'll just be good stewards and leave. We don't know. And so it's really put a lot of pressure on, the commercial companies, the Axioms and the Orbital Reef teams build their commercial stations, and the DoD and NASA is saying, hey, what can we do to make this go faster? And they said, it's not money, it's not tech, it's people. We need bodies. And so we've got a big workforce challenges ahead of us that I don't know how we solve that. But I'm here at a community and technical college, part of the Manufacturers Association. We just agreed to set up an aerospace manufacturing degree. It's like a 1-year program. So I'm excited about that. I'm going to help them get in touch with all the big primes or space companies that are hiring for CNC machiners. So we've got to have that global or that nationwide, hey, maybe we can fill these, take on a big challenge. I want to be an aerospace manufacturer.
Why be
it's not
consumers when you could be producers, right?
Yeah, we got to make physical goods, things that people use. I think actually Putin talked about that. He said he's a terrible man. I want him gone. But he kind of said some harsh realities that, the West, has these make-believe products and economies that are, we think about commodities and metals and oils and waters, all conflict usually starts out as a scarcity of resources. So we're getting back to a little more reality, I think. And I just hope that people can be optimistic about the future. I know I am. And it's hard to do that sometimes if you're working in a place that you don't like, and you've been at home for all this time and isolated. So we've got to have some national, we were talking about how the UAE has a public mission of settling on Mars. They publicly say that, and the Chinese have a well thought out goal for space. The United States doesn't have that.
You talked about how you do go to people within Congress, and you want to get the ones that aren't on the space councils, the ones that aren't already sold. I think that's really vital for the public as well, because I look at the changes and the differences between Chinese, public and American public, and the average Chinese citizen very much wants to see their nation get to space first, wants to see their nation build in space and operate there. The average American, if you ask them about space, they draw a blank. And I think that's something that's our fault. We've gotten very comfortable, and we've been very comfortable with other countries handling the major production. So I think it starts really, first of all, with the public perception and the public backing of us getting into space. And we need to help them understand why it's important, why it's vital, but also how they can play a part. Because I have this conversation as a science explainer. One of my jobs is to help people understand, first of all, it's real. This is something we're doing now, not in 100 years. Second of all, that this is something that we really need, and then how do they play a part? So once we do that, then we can change things like the educational system and workforce training and colleges so that we can start prioritizing, an economy where we produce rather than just consume imported goods.
No, I think you're spot on there. It's our fault. We haven't, it felt so exclusionary. It's like so prestige, like you have to be so smart to do this space. And people just, I could never do that, but they don't realize the types of roles we need: HR, accounting, welders, CNC machine operators. Yeah, science and engineering and math, but really the hard, as we're gonna really make an industry and we start mass producing these things, it's not one-off satellites or rockets anymore. We're doing these things every day. And how can a state like a flyover state, how can their manufacturing base, they already do support the space industry. It's just no one knows it. Like Kentucky exports $15 billion in aerospace a year. It's our biggest industry, above bourbon and horses and even automobiles. We have Toyota's global headquarters in Kentucky. It's a huge industry, but aerospace outpaces it. No one in the whole state even knows. I got into the space.
Water in Kentucky. Something's in your water there. I've met a lot of amazing, innovative people there in Kentucky. In fact, there's a guy opening up a new chip factory in Kentucky to create microprocessors and chips here in America. So something's going on there.
That's Aaron Hardin.
That's Aaron
right?
Hardin. Yeah, Aaron. Okay.
Not Aaron. Yeah, it's so I got into the space business. I live in Lexington. I'm in DC every month, but I live in Lexington, Kentucky. And I was at lunch one day and I overheard these guys say Space Tango. And I was like, hey, I've been following you guys. You do all that cool microgravity research on the ISS. And he's like, come by the office sometime. And I did. And I walk in, I see a live stream of the ISS and live astronauts doing science projects. And I'm like, holy shit, this is in Lexington. And then long story short, I ended up working with them and been helping them on the Hill and things. But it just, I didn't know, it took that like extra layer of effort for me as a geek. I'm an engineer classically, but do more political things now, but always been translating. But I had to do a lot of hops to get into the business from Kentucky. It's just, but now I'm part of this manufacturers association. I'm going up to Northern Kentucky where they're making like critical steel components for Starship. And they're solving their welding problems for them. Just a small business, mom and pop shop that are, it's amazing. And just, I didn't have any clue, but that's the stories we need to tell. It's the people, and it's blue collar, white collar, it's everything, and it's not exclusionary. And I think manufacturing sounds like, oh, I don't want to do that. That sounds dangerous or something like you're in the 30s. But if you add aerospace manufacturing to that, it's like, oh, well, and it's the same job. It's just you have a little more prestige there. I think people need to feel like that's something worthy of them to be proud of. And I think that space can do that. And I think it can help really bring a lot of people out of, people in rural Kentucky, like they don't have, why could I get in this space business? But I'm talking with these community college guys, and they've got VR training now for CNC machines. So instead of having to go to a school and set up in all this expensive machinery, they can, train 80% on VR and learn how to operate these things and weld. And then, you go do your final exam, if you will. But I'm trying to create that little workforce here in the state, and hopefully I can help send those off to people, to Blue and SpaceX and all the small companies starting out that need people to do that work. And I'm excited to get started on that.
At a time when we're so divided, I think American society is so divided and fracturing more and more every day. We need a national myth to bring us together. We need a national drive. And I think space really is the best answer for that. I mean, I'm a little bit biased. Pretty much, if you have a problem, I think space is where the solutions live. But I really think that, transitioning our public into more hands-on, like manufacturing, for instance, and bringing the prestige back to the fact that we're supplying American goods and we're building it here in America for the people. We need a shift in perspective there. I think that's where we could bring people together, honestly.
I love that. I love the myth thing. I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell. I don't know if you.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So the power of the myth. If you haven't watched that, there's a series about that. It's incredible, but it's the hero's journey. You gotta go create something that may or not be true factually, but you have to believe in something just to do
I
things.
think truth isn't the motivation. Elon Musk talks about you have to have a reason to wake up in the morning and be excited. That's where the myth is built together. I think if we can be excited about building in America and creating that new future in space together, then it doesn't really matter where the factual entry point is for people. As long as we know that truth together, I think we can do so much. We're really unstoppable.
Yeah, I think we've got so much information now that it's like we realize everyone's been lying to us this whole time, all of our experts and leaders. And I hope we can get back to like, okay, well, it's okay to if it's towards some altruistic thing that's going to help us, it's okay to not have to be 100% true. Everyone wants to be like, well, this is not exactly true. And that happens with arguments with religions all the time. And they all kind of rhyme and it's all about being a good person and sacrificing a little bit for longer good, but it's important, and I think space can do that. It's going to take a lot of work though, and
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's going to. I hope it doesn't take some sort of Pearl Harbor moment in space, but Artemis. I mean, it hasn't been that inspiring to a lot of people yet. So I think it's really the people that are underrepresented, the manufacturer being based that are all over the country, and giving people, the opportunity to say, oh, I can be from anywhere in the world and I can work in the space industry. It's important. We need to have we need to rebuild our international relations, and I think space is the best way to do that. It's interesting. So the world's changing. It always has been. We didn't start the fire.
So true. We're always in a state of transition, really. I think the same mentality that got me in trouble as a child is why I've been so successful as an adult. And I want to infect people with that. When people say, oh, it's impossible, we can't do that. My whole thought is you're not trying hard enough, or you haven't tried enough, way to get around this thing. So that's what I want to see, is that as we ignite this myth in the American public, people stop looking for the easy roads and they start finding any road that will get them there and make the roads where there aren't roads. So Rob, this is really interesting. I want to get the audience involved here. If any of you have questions here on Zoom or any of our live streaming platforms, go ahead and text those to us and we'll be glad to ask Rob. If you're in the Zoom, feel free to put your hand up and we'll unmute your mic if you'd like to ask directly. We have a comment here from Darsh. Great perspective. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Darsh. You're one of my favorite spacers. Darsh is actually a science explainer. He's known around the world. Awesome. Well, we definitely need more of those, and giving that access to people that don't have it. It's important. So thank you for what you do, and you and Nara as well. I guess Rebecca, you had a question. Go ahead.
I do have a question. Rob, great talk. I learned so much from you, and I just reached out to you on LinkedIn. I would love to keep in touch. I have a question that I know that Morgan, who is up soon as one of our speakers, will be talking about, but I wanted to ask for your opinion about the 2021 Rubio Space Act. Do you think that it will help with us exiting from aerospace consumerism, for example, supplying ourselves from supplying US aerospace from China? And if that does help us exit from aerospace consumerism with China, how will that impact our aerospace businesses in the US on the short term? Do you think that it'll stifle our space economy at first while we're getting this going? What's your opinion?
Well, I think it's really important for us to build our own capabilities. It's pretty clear that, space is obviously a place for unlimited economic activity and jobs and resources for the betterment of the planet, but it's also become a war fighting domain, and it's very contested, and we can't afford to have a critical asset in space that could be compromised, and it's a very real threat. And I guess you're seeing it all throughout the DoD, but I think maybe if it's not a critical component, then on a complete commercial thing, I don't know. It's a real hard question. I think we've got to do it, bite the bullet, and just start from scratch, or else we're going to be compromised like we already kind of are.
Thank you. Good stuff. Thank you. Appreciate your opinion.
Rob, I want to ask you, as we reposition ourselves globally, the geopolitical realignment, do you think it's really going to be just us bringing our traditional partners with us, or do you think this new alignment is going to create new divisions and new partnerships as we venture forward into space?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ambitious countries that want to have a space program. A lot of countries in Africa, and the Chinese are very aggressive on helping finance their ambitions and their infrastructure. I think that's going to be interesting, what comes out of Africa. I think Kenya is going to be like one of the most populous country, like top 3 in like the next 5 years. So it's kind of wild. The Indians are very interesting to me. They have not said they're going to play with us, or they're not taking sides. I think they're pretty independent, and they're pretty proud of their country. And I think they're going to be very interesting to watch where they go and how they cooperate. Yeah, it's going to be kind of different. I don't think it's going to look as black and white as it has been for so long. So
we have to wrap up, but one more prediction I need from you. ITAR, do we see ITAR restructured based on this new future we're building?
I hope so, because every country, the EU has different export control regs, and so does the US. So I'm hoping that we could figure out, some sort of global, I don't know if it's a treaty that can take on supply chain that works on critical industries. It could take on ITAR and sharing information. I think, we've got how many launch vehicles right now? Like, I think a lot of them are probably going to go to different countries, that need that capability. I think our manufacturing base here in Kentucky, in the US, is going to start. We don't have enough demand from the US side, so the UAE really wants to do ambitious things. Like, I want to make stuff for them. So we got to find some sort of framework as not only trade partners, information rights partners, and maybe that's an extension to Artemis Accords. But I want to see, and even like from a venture capital or finance perspective, what countries have safe money, if you will, and I'm raising money for my startup. Like, I wish I could go to a place where all that money's safe and they're friendly, from Italy or wherever they are in the world. And I hope there's a big global thing that could be a new partnership. And I think, but space is that place that brings all that stuff together. And I'm optimistic about the future. So
I love it. Well, Rob, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
All right, so next up we have Frank White and Jared Anganza. I'm so glad that you two are joining us. You're two of my favorite people in the space industry. Thank you for being here today. So if you don't know, Frank White is the author of The Overview Effect, Space Exploration and Human Evolution, considered to be a seminal work in the field of space exploration, making him one of the most influential space philosophers of our time. So Frank is known for his overview effect, which is, I think, one of the most promising paths forward for humanity personally. Jared Nganza is an activist, philanthropist, and strategist. Over the past 25 years, he has leveraged his studies of behavioral economics, consciousness, and culture to develop leaders, brands, and organizations across the globe. Jared is a published author and a master storyteller, focused largely on environmental preservation, inclusion, and diversity, conscious space exploration, and preserving indigenous wisdom. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Welcome today.
Oh, we're glad to be here, Anara. How are you doing?
Anytime I'm with a bunch of spacers, I'm happy. So especially if you two are in the room.
All right. Are you going to kick it off with a question or shall we just start?
You know what? I'm going to go ahead and let you start.
All right. Jared, shall I go?
Always, you go first. Yeah.
Well, not always. My voice is not what it should be, so you probably going to get the bulk of it. Jared and I decided not to do PowerPoints and just to have a conversation. And I really appreciated everything that Rob had to say. However, I do want to say that Jared and I, who our primary work right now is the Human Space Program, which grew out of the Overview Effect, and we're holding out hope for international collaboration as we move off the planet. That's the great promise, is that we can do that. I realize we are not naive. We realize that won't be easy, but that is our focus. However, there is a problem that doesn't originate in China or Russia or any particular country. And I want to start where I usually end in this conversation. I want to start with the nuclear power industry. You might say, why are you doing that? What's that got to do with space? Well, the problem that Jared and I want to talk about is public opinion about the global space enterprise. And if you don't think public opinion can derail a promising effort, look at nuclear power. Let's be agnostic. Maybe you hate nuclear power and you're glad it's being derailed, or maybe you think it's a positive solution for global warming. Full transparency, I went from being an opponent to being a supporter. And the reason is, in my extension school classes at Harvard, all of my students join a mythical team and they do public relations. And I had a group that did public relations for a mythical nuclear power company. And they did such a great job that I thought, you guys have a point. Anyway, I think you get what I'm driving at here. Public opinion can be an obstacle to a promising enterprise. What we're talking about is not a mission to the moon or a mission to Mars. We are talking about large-scale space migration. We're not talking about abandoning the planet. We are talking about helping the planet by expanding to a larger ecosystem, doing it consciously, doing it with environmental awareness. We are talking about uniting the environmental movement and the space movement and it's about time. This message has to get out. And what Jared and I are seeing is, it's like when you're flying over a target. I hate to use a military analogy, but you're flying over a target and you're dropping flak, and nobody knows what to shoot at. There's a lot of flak in the commentary, the narrative right now about the space enterprise. I think it really was always there. We always have heard this ridiculous comment of why are you going into space when there are problems on Earth? I'm sorry, but that's how I feel about it. But that was always a kind of a low rumble in the background. When Jeff Bezos flew on Blue Origin, it erupted into a vitriolic, negative narrative, and it became the billionaire space race. It's ironic, and I'm going to close with this and turn it over to Jared to tell you, what we're doing about it. But Jeff Bezos actually has the right idea. He's an O'Neillian. He thinks this is the best planet. He thinks if we leave the planet, it'll be good for the Earth. And I can say all of that, and yet that isn't what people see. So he has the right message, and he's the wrong messenger. Not his fault, maybe, or maybe it is. I'm not commenting on his labor practices or any other aspect of his behavior. However, we have to make sure that the right message is shared with the global public with the right messenger. And just to conclude, I began to be concerned about this several years ago and began to talk about a broad strategic communications plan to share a narrative that is hopeful and positive and is not about missions, but about migration. It's exciting. It will give hope to humanity. And I was sharing that really before this eruption of negativity. Now, however, we're in the midst of it. It's happening. The negativity is there. And so it's up to us to deal with that. And the Human Space Program, we're working on it with some partners. And I think we have a good opportunity to turn this thing around, but not through complacency. It really is a significant threat to the enterprise. And I believe that much of our energy and much of our efforts ought to go toward not necessarily knocking down the negative narrative, but lifting up a positive narrative. And again, this is a kind of a daily conversation between Jared and me. I will now just let Jared pick it up and talk about exactly what we're trying to do about it, and hope we can recruit some allies today.
So before we go to Jared, I want to respond really quickly to you, Frank. First of all, I'm honored to work with you at the Human Space Program. I think it's really the platform we need at this time for the messaging that has to happen for people to really make that transition. I love how you talked about being an opponent to nuclear energy, and then now you're a proponent to it, and it was just a message that you got in the right way that made that switch. I think a lot of people who are opposed to nuclear power, their frame of mind when it comes to that topic is nuclear bombs. So when we're saying the word nuclear, for them, they see bombs dropping and people being harmed and the military aspect of it. And that's really the conversation we've had publicly, especially from the media side. And I think the media has some goods and some bads. And one of the negatives is that there are playbooks on certain topics. So when it comes to space, oftentimes their massive playbook that they have goes back to the Cold War era. So they talk about competition and conflict. And so when we're looking at Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk both doing some really amazing things, they frame it in the sense that these two are fighting or competing for space rather than showing the two efforts. And the same thing with nuclear power. I think that they go back to their old playbook of nuclear bombs. And so people don't see all the positive aspects. But the Human Space Program focusing on the O'Neillian understanding that we don't go to space to escape the planet or kind of to toss it aside, but really embracing the amazing qualities it has and furthering that more. I think that's the message that the Human Space Program does so well. I'm excited to see how we can spread that to the public even more.
Thanks, Anara. Very well said. Thank you. Jared.
All right, I'll jump in. Yeah, thank you for that, Anara, and thank you, Frank. Yeah, this is a big part of our conversation, has been for a long time. I come from the marketing and brand world, and was super inspired by the overview effect early on and connected with Frank, and we've been co-creating since, which is an honor. And we're merging those conversations and everything that we're doing at Human Space Program. And that program it's a central project to develop a citizen authored blueprint for conscious migration and stewardship of the solar ecosystem. There's a lot of things packed into that little sentence there, but we're looking at the solar ecosystem as this garden, that we're in, and Earth is part of that. It's a vegetable in that garden, if you will. And we're taking that same kind of, I came in as an environmentalist and human rights activist and so on. And then we've been coupling that into the conversation and recognizing that we have the opportunity now to take this same passion for protecting the planet as an environmentalist out into the greater solar ecosystem and look at this sustainable, ethical, inclusive stewardship rather than conquering of the ecosystem. As we go out, we've seen what colonization has done to the planet and those kind of motivations. And now we're looking at it saying, okay, we need to be real intentional about our motivation here. What are we trying to do? We want to become stewards. Now, to get to the media and policy side of that, which is what this conversation is about, I think our policies should be driven by that agenda to become stewards. It's important what's motivating your policies, obviously, your policy making. I feel like that deliberate contemplation and planning of conscious migration, like how do we do this better when we go off the planet, it has a direct influence on how we choose to live on Earth today. I think that should be a driving factor of the policies that we're working on and creating. And then, in addition to that, the media around it makes such a big difference. As Frank was just pointing out with the nuclear side of things. And then you look at the Apollo missions and what was happening there, the beginning of Apollo, everybody's glued to the TV, millions of people and all that. And by the end, it just sort of fizzled out, but there wasn't as much public support. And consequently, we didn't launch anybody off the US soil from 2011 until just a couple of years ago with SpaceX. So public opinion matters a lot with what we're trying to do here. Right now, I think most in terms of media, what's driving most of public opinion is what they're seeing on Netflix and what they're seeing on the news and things like that. And the news is just, doing whatever. We're not deliberately, I think, affecting that. I think it's just sort of happening. Like Frank was, it's just black stuff going everywhere. and they shoot at the easiest targets, the lowest hanging fruit, like the environmental impact, which, by the way, is a much more complex discussion. We have some efforts going on now at Human Space Program to deliberately impact that conversation, I guess, of what the environmental impact and the implications, the future implications of the space programs. We're looking at different propellants all the time. We're looking. The idea is that we recognize, and I'm speaking for the greater space community here, that we have to be focused on sustainability. We can't do the same things that we did before. And I think most of the public just looks at it and says, well, they're just going to do the same thing that they did before. Why would we do that? So we need to be better at communications. I think the space community in general, NASA for sure, and NASA's done quite a bit of this more lately, and getting more publications out there, getting more videos out there, and capitalizing kind of on that on YouTube and things like that. We have to be really serious about that if we're going to get the public support, again, like the nuclear concept. If we don't have it, we're constantly going upstream. There has to be a greater concerted collective effort to address what media is getting out to people, to create more media, to create more content. And also I just was joking to the Overview Roundtable yesterday about if I wave my magic wand, which I think Frank has, we can I'd be making films and videos all day long, because that seems to be what impacts people's opinions so much. The sci-fi world has been in some ways great for that, and also sort of like it's often showing sort of the damning aspects of what could happen. And we see The Expanse, which I am a huge fan, but it's saying if we keep doing what we're doing, if we carry forward what we're doing, this is what we can expect: more war and conflict and division. And Frank touched on this at the end a second ago. We at the Human Space Program take the approach of, we have to be better at painting a better picture, a more beautiful picture of what can be. I don't even want to go to, having been in this, in this media world for a long time, going toe to toe and just combating like, oh, they said this, so we're going to say that, or they said this, and just going back and forth. That's not the way to do it. I think anytime stuff's coming at us, we can certainly take that information in and contemplate it and then use it to inform some of the things that we do. But then from that, we're responsible, I believe, for creating a more beautiful picture of what it can look like as we expand off the planet. Frank's been talking about the large scale space migration for a long time, and we're doing some simulations around that at HSP. That isn't leaving the planet to leave it behind. It's saying, what if we just managed our population better? And when we talk about population control, I've been a human rights activist for a long time. There's some nasty conversations around population control ideas. But the idea of saying, what if even older people that could do a little bit better in less gravity were in a beautiful cylinder, up in the sky, and had this beautiful existence rather than just being, put in the nursing home or whatever. There's things like, there's much more humane ways to address this. And that's not a conversation that makes it to the top of the media, obviously. That's buried way down below. And I think we've got to be better in the community about intentionally bringing those complex conversations forward and creating media around it that inspires people. I'm a parent. I don't shame my kids into the behavior I want them to be, to have. I try to inspire them into that. I lead by example, and I think we need to do the same as people in the space community here, and say we've got to be intentional about how we paint a more beautiful and inspiring picture, because at the end of the day, having studied human behavior my whole life, people change a lot more when they're inspired than when they're commanded or demanded to do so, or if they're shamed into it just by, well, if you don't do this, everybody dies, or if you keep doing this, it's all going to hell. Those things are true. We understand that. However, if it worked, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now if that kind of tactic worked. So tactically, I think we have to be painting a better picture.
Absolutely. I think we're dealing with the path of least resistance. When it comes to the environmental organizations, one of the amazing things about this age of environmentalism, I know you and I both have been involved for quite a while in those spaces, it's more organized than ever. It's more networked than ever globally. So information flows very quickly across those lines if done properly. But the problem is that once something is kind of solidified as far as an ideal, oftentimes it's hard to change that across that platform. Right now, I see the dichotomy that's being put forward in the environmental, circles of space versus nature, or space versus environmentalism. And I think that arises from the fact that space is scary. It's big and it's massive, and a lot of people don't know how to connect to it. And oftentimes when we don't feel something's accessible, it's easy to go, oh, no, not that. Or to say, why I can't prioritize that. And so it starts with that, and then it becomes this, animosity towards, and I see that a lot. We need to change that dialogue from space versus nature to space being a packet of solves for the environmentalist wing. Instead of going to the media, we have all these amazing communicators and we have the organizations themselves. But I think you're right in saying it's our responsibility. I don't see a broad plan or a broad strategy across all these different space organizations on how we get that messaging, how we embed it or vectorize it into the environmental movements. How can we build, like Jared, especially from you, how do we build a broad platform of cooperation between all these different space organizations to curate that message and get it out there?
We're looking at that right now. I've got a couple of projects over the next 48 hours that are sort of addressing that right now. I think we have to take it chunk by chunk to some degree. what we're doing at the Human Space Program is really kind of focusing on the environmental impact, and that merging those two worlds. We recognize that there needs to be a very broad discussion, or effort rather, to address all these different aspects of what does space exploration mean? What does migration off the planet mean? What is all that, in terms of human rights and even economics? Everything we're doing has an economic engine behind it. So we have to talk about the economics of things. I think the easiest, lowest hanging fruit that the media always hits on is the environmental impact.
Yeah.
In Human Space Program, again, we're looking at, the sustainable, ethical, inclusive stewardship of the solar ecosystem. That's for us as an organization to be focused on the environment and how it affects humans and all that, and what we do as we move off the planet, and what the implications are of the space industry, especially the industry part. People are talking about rocket pollution and things like that. I think we've got to just address it head on. And what we want to do is to bring in other environmentalists and say, look, let's have a better discussion. We need better discussions about this. It can't just be them over there and us over here, and then we're just like hitting it back and forth over the net. We have to come together and have a better discussion. We're in this. Frank started this concept and this idea 30 some years ago because of feeling the need that we've got to have some sort of, not just a governing system, but kind of a central project for people to come together, the people, as we talk about, for everyone to come together and have a voice in this and say, look, we care about this. And it's not just about supporting the space industry either. It's really about, how do we consciously migrate? We recognize the space industry is doing it. So let's have a conversation about it. Let's bring in all the different stakeholders, as we often say. And I think that starts with the environmentalists and people that really care about this planet, and say, what if we extended that same sort of resolve and passion and compassion for protecting the planet into the entire solar ecosystem? What does that look like? As I also know, as an environmentalist, I've been pulling all of my environmental data from satellites, which wouldn't be there without the space community. So we're already working together. And we also know that when people go up and look at the Earth from orbit or the moon or whatever, they're having this overview effect. And they're coming back as humanitarians and philanthropists to a much further degree even than when they left. And they're looking at, they can't look at the world the same way. That's powerful. And we have leaders coming back with that kind of perspective. That is the kind of perspective that we believe can help us heal our relationships here on Earth right now with each other and with the planet that we live on.
Absolutely. Frank, you started this, the overview effect. 30 years ago, you kicked this off. You've coined the term. You've built a philosophical circle, which I think has been very powerful. What do you hope the legacy, the ultimate legacy out of this movement is?
Well, that's quite a question. I do hope that the ultimate legacy is that humanity has a positive future, and it's a positive future on Earth and in the solar ecosystem. I've joked about this, Inara, and you and Jared have heard me say it. I did not write the book to win a Pulitzer Prize or a Nobel Prize for literature. I wrote it to help create a revolution in human thought. I do believe, too, that the theory of the overview effect and the experience of the overview effect is the core of having this positive future. And it really did not begin with astronauts, although that's where it has gone through interviewing astronauts. It started with my working with Gerard K. O'Neill and thinking about what would people living permanently off the planet, what would they see when they looked at Earth in the sky? And they would see a whole system where everything's interrelated and interconnected. And one of the positive benefits of large-scale space migration to the Earth will be those folks who live permanently and always see the earth in that way. When they come back, they're going to be powerful philosophers, excuse me. They're going to be powerful space philosophers with really a higher level of consciousness. And they're going to bring this message that the astronauts are bringing, but in huge waves. And, I know we're getting close to the end of time, but one thing I would say is the power of words is really remarkable. The overview effect has become a term that everybody uses in order to talk about this experience. And at the Human Space Program, we're looking at words that will capture what we hope to do with bringing these movements together. Currently, we're working with green space as a term, and we'll see if it lasts. You never know. Some things catch on and some things don't. But in closing, I would like to say, Inara, the legacy will not occur with a book. It will not end with a book. It must become a movement, a global movement to bring the overview effect down to earth. And I will close by saying that, as I've said many times before, it should be a human right to experience the overview effect, either directly or indirectly. And that is part of what I hope the legacy will be.
Absolutely. We encounter those people or those ideas that changes forever. And I can say honestly that encountering your work, I see a divider in my life with space before and after encountering your ideals and your work, because before I was looking at space as a place, an opportunity, a set of resources, and I saw all these different movements, different businesses and nations that could go out into this location and do maybe something different. But after encountering the overview effect, in my mind, I see a new civilization birthing from that. I don't see us being the same once we get out there. And I really look forward to that shift on the civilizational level that I know is going to come from that. Thank you so much, Jared and Frank, for being with us today. Always a pleasure.
Great being with you.
Thank you, Inara.
You're welcome.
Could
All
I
right.
just say in closing,
Sure, please, Frank, go ahead.
we need to give a little bit of acknowledgement to Inara. Inara, you not only got the message, you spread it, you share it. You're bringing people into this movement at a level that to Jared and me, it's just awe-inspiring. So
Thank you. That means a lot.
thank
Frank.
you.
Amen to that.
Absolutely. Worthy, definitely. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Jared. So next up, we have Morgan Muchnick and Sabrina Westerman. Sabrina Westerman has worked in applied engineering in many fields, such as civil, agricultural, mechanical, and electrical engineering. She has recently retired from her academic career to work for CubeCab, as she has been interested in space since childhood. Morgan is the founder of the M2 Group, LLC. He has 20 years of expertise in government and public affairs, including senior professional staff to the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, focused on space, cybersecurity, and transportation. His passion is working with innovative companies that are disrupting state business paradigms in need of reform, such as CubeCab. Morgan, Sabrina, thank you for joining us.
Hello, thank you. Sabrina.
Thank you for having us.
Excellent.
Can you see? Can
We
you see
can.
the screen?
We can, so that's good. Our tech is working.
Sweet.
It's always nice.
The screen looks good. I think what we'll probably do is I'll just say a couple of quick words of introduction and a brief overview of a small handful of interesting pieces of legislation that are floating around the Hill these days. And then I would like to leave the majority of the time for Sabrina to really dig in a little bit on a more granular level about what small innovative companies like CubeCab is doing and can do, where in space, I use in quotes, because it's a lot of great work that we may not automatically think of when we think of some of these big macro projects that are sort of space related. So if I could just say very quickly first, just in 2 sentences about the last speakers. So I thought it was a very good discussion. My only concern about that is some of the issues brought up were very, very nuanced. You know, you mentioned this thing of senior citizens living in space. My only concern is how much of a society, how serious are we as a society? Our society doesn't feel as serious as I wish we were. And I feel like one person says one thing on CNN wrong or Fox News wrong, then they get blasted all over social media and their careers are damaged. And it's not a great time, I think right now, unfortunately, in America, to cultivate thoughtful, serious discussions on some of these more complex problems. That gives me the biggest pause about sort of think where we are in America. We don't have to get into that now. I just wanted to get that off my chest. Okay. So
honestly, we could have a whole hour-long show about that at some point, Morgan.
Yeah, for sure. So if you can go ahead and go to the first slide, let's just maybe sort of jump into this. That'd be awesome. Can we go to slide 2? Great. So obviously right now, the vast majority of oxygen being taken up here in DC is obviously the midterm elections coming up, and then the big spending bills that have just come through over the last few months or so. So, you know, this is just a very quick sort of bit about, you know, what was passed recently with the Inflation Reduction Act. Depending on where you view on that and whether that's an applicable term or not is very fair, but it's that is by far the biggest piece of legislation that, you know, is, you know, being discussed and debated and used for and against different candidates in the upcoming midterm elections. So that's, you know, almost all of the intellectual energy. We can go next slide, please. Let's see. We can go to the next slide would be awesome. Let's see if maybe I can press it. Okay, there it goes. But there are a few bits of interesting legislation. It was brought up a little bit earlier, this issue of Marco Rubio's interesting bill called the Space Act, which I find very interesting. It's really focused on China, and it's really focused on sort of it's going to be, I think, a number of steps as the United States starts to differentiate and separate itself from China and China-related interests. So it's important to know, though, this piece of legislation and one or two other ones that we'll mention next really are not being really discussed at any really high level right now. So it's a boring discussion if I say really nothing's going on, but there are some things going on. Maybe in the next Congress, some of these things might take hold. Definitely 0% chance that between now and November, these things will become law. But they're there, and Marco Rubio is very much establishing himself as a leadership role on the Republican side on space issues, national security, and China. That's clearly the case. You can go through these on your own time. We'll make these available, these slides as well. It's a very high level, simple introduction to some of these pieces of legislation. If we could pivot to the next slide, please.
Bit of a delay, but it's coming.
Yeah, no, it's there. It's no problem. Thank you. Yes. So this is a piece of legislation focused on how NASA manages STEM-related grants and trying to improve and make a more accurate reflection of what the society looks like in terms of STEM or STEAM, as some people use, and things of that nature. It's trying to improve and modernize how we use our grant programs in the United States. This one is bipartisan. It's not just Senator Rubio. So if it's a piece of bipartisan legislation, I really do think that so as a quick pause on this, looking ahead to the next this coming up election in the next Congress, at worst, from a Republican point of view, at worst, the Republicans will win the House of Representatives. They may also win the Senate. That seems to be a little less likely these days. Regardless, it's going to be a split Congress, and the only chance of legislation being brought up through the process is going to be bipartisan in nature. It's going to be very, very gridlocked. So the positive from a space advocate's point of view, however, is that space does offer a unique opportunity to become a bipartisan point that maybe things can get done. Cybersecurity is another one of those issues. But most issues are going to be hyper partisan and hyper sort of aggressive with each other. So let's pivot to one more quick little bit of information that just came out a day or two ago, which is quite interesting. Go to the next slide. And that is what's called the Orbits Act. This just came out of the Senate just, I think, a couple days ago. Very interesting piece of legislation. And I think that, you know, this has to do, and this actually will be touched upon with QCAB as well, was how we manage and continue to identify and work with orbital debris. Obviously, we had the very troubling issue with Russia and the anti-satellite event, you know, a while back. And as we watch Russia wage war in Ukraine, and we're worried about what they may or may not do to lash out, whether it's nuclear or whether it may be anti-satellite, this is going to be a continuing issue and something that's going to be on the forefront of a lot of policymakers who are worried about that aspect of international defense. So I think, you know, let me go ahead and sort of leave off this, and I want to make sure there's plenty of time for Sabrina, and I want to also engage this a little bit in our Q&A if we have time, because I think there's a tremendous amount of interesting nuances and issues and sub-issues that are around this issue, this public policy issue. And I wanted to keep also this overview a bit more focused on domestic security, domestic policy, less about international affairs and international conflict. That's always, unfortunately, overarching, you know, a lot of the things that we think about right now. And that's going to be a fine line that our leaders in Congress and the office and the presidency, they're going to have to sort of walk. But thank you for this. And Sabrina, I'm excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you. So first of all, why on earth does QCAB care about rapid launch? Well, that's because we actually developed a rapid launch system for 3U CubeSats. And in doing so, we found two things that is really somewhat barriers to having that as an option right now. And one of them is government funding for the rapid launch procedures and or technology development. But another one is the FAA and other organizations have so many different paperwork restrictions that are going to be a bit problematic when we start into rapid launch. And so that process also needs to be sped up. Now, why do we need this? I mean, we've been doing the same thing for years. Why do we change? Because we could use this rapid launch for restoring communications quickly, early detection of natural disasters, repair or replacing damaged or outdated satellites, and also rapid response to on-orbit events, as we've been talking about. So many years ago, this is where I get into the story. Many years ago, I lived basically in the middle of nowhere, but we had house phones, which are, I know, an old concept, but we had a house phone, and we got one of those newfangled phones that had caller ID on it and plugged into the wall as well as into the phone line. Only right after we got that, Hurricane Andrew hit, and that was in 1992. And when Hurricane Andrew hit, we had an entire week without power, without seeing another human being, basically, because everything went down. And we weren't even on the coast, okay? This was up in the mountains. So, you know, a hurricane of that size, while we go, oh, well, that doesn't happen very often, we actually have quite a few that have happened. But in the realm of what happened during that week, we had a line of tornadoes that were drawn to the center of Hurricane Andrew, which downed trees, rows of them. So all of our pastures had the fence down, and our neighbors, our next door neighbors, actually had the the road was completely blocked, but it was up at a point where we didn't see it from the house. And so we never realized that they were completely cut off from civilization. So they could not even leave their house. I mean, they could leave their house, but they couldn't leave to go to town and get supplies. And so there was a lot of things we had to do. We had to get the old phone system out in order to make a call and let people know we were okay. We had to actually, I remember we took the old TV out of the house and hooked it up to a car battery just to get the news. Okay. So that was kind of things that most people don't think about when it comes to the power going out, something just as simple as the power going out. And the thing of it is, when these natural disasters happen, communications is one of the first things that go. And communications to me is the media, you know, giving and sharing that information. You know, we didn't know how bad it was even in town versus where we were, because we couldn't get to town and we didn't have any newscasts from town. So, you know, thankfully we survived, but there's so many people that don't have a house phone, even something as simple as a house phone anymore. So there's a lot of things that happen. Natural disasters have gone up. The amount has gone up. The severity of them has gone up. They produced 21 named storms last year. I mean, this has been the worst hurricane season we've had. But it's not just hurricanes, it's hurricanes and earthquakes. I mean, I remember watching the news stories about the Northridge earthquake in '94. Terrible, terrible times for humanity. And of course, more recently, we have Katrina. I actually worked with some people who had gone through Katrina and had evacuated to our area. And one of the things that they kept bringing out was the lack of communication, because they could not communicate with friends and loved ones. They had no idea where their friends and loved ones were. They didn't know where their neighbors had gone off to, where they had evacuated to. And so they have no way of contacting them, even when they left. But while they were there, some of the stories was so horrible, yet interesting, that, you know, organizations like FEMA did not have the capability to communicate with their workers. So they ended up delivering things like bottled water to the wrong areas. And things like that, you know, we have advanced in technology to the point that we can actually, you know, restore these communications a lot easier with satellites. And this rapid launch would be able to help with that. The first 72 hours after a natural disaster is something that's very vital. And we can, with rapid launch, get a satellite up and restore communications by then. And that's amazing. FEMA could even have an entire satellite constellation on the ready, so that, you know, the minute this happens somewhere, they can restore communications. The technology's there. It just needs these few hurdles to get through. Also, I found it fascinating that NOAA is actually working on sensors for CubeSats so that they can monitor oceans a lot better. And in doing so, you know, they can give tsunami warnings more earlier. They can track hurricanes earlier. And there's so many benefits from this entire system. Another way to use these is to repair or replace damaged or outdated satellites. The technology, again, is there. And, you know, like the comment just said, you know, yeah, from Morgan, public policy is behind in this, you know, and we're focused on what we've always done in the past. And now, you know, we can actually make life better, not just for us, but for the entire United States. And as we've been talking about the on-orbit events, Laura was talking about this yesterday with the ASATs. If an ASAT is used and a satellite blows up into a million pieces, it's so much easier to get that fixed immediately than to have that cloud of debris sitting there in orbit, growing exponentially and threatening all of our assets. It's easier to handle. It's just like any kind of mess. If you spill kitty litter somewhere, it's easier to clean it up right then than track it through the entire house. Okay, same principle. If we use this rapid launch, we can use it on these on-orbit events and have it where it does not affect the rest of the world. So we have the ability to rapidly launch these things. CubeCab specifically has developed this next day rocket launch, and I really am excited about it. But, you know, it's like so many other companies. We've been looking into orbital debris and been working in that field a little bit. And there's so many companies that have great ideas that are just ready to implement them, but they need that last bit of technology to get that hardware tested and ready to launch before they can finalize the stuff. Well, once it's finalized, then we have the policies, and we're going to run into that problem. And it's not, the reason we have these policies is because we are used to having months, years before a launch happens. And so, hey, why don't you fill out this paperwork? And we've got this thing, why don't we do it manually? And we'll check the trajectories of everything else while we're at it. And they're used to having that cushion period, that lead time. And they don't have that. They won't have that with rapid launch. And so a lot of those systems are going to need to be changed. And whoops, that is the slide I want. Okay. Most of those policies are going to need to be changed. And, you know, the paperwork and approval process right now must be streamlined. It must be organized, and it must be automated so that we can have that quicker approval process for satellite launch. And we can get these things up in the air and restore communications or use them for what we need to deal with these on-orbit events as they happen. And, you know, some things can be set up ahead of time, as in what-if scenarios, but that paperwork process is going to be a very big issue, I think. And in the policy aspect, that's how policy and media combine there. So yeah, that is my section. And we have links to further information. And Morgan, do you want to start with the questions? If we've got any questions?
Sure. And I would just say that, you know, we will distribute this slide deck for anyone that's interested. So feel free to,
Yes.
you know, when we get a copy of that, to reach out to us, you know, with any sort of questions and things like that. You know, I think what's particularly interesting is that this type of technology, the sort of low cost, quick launch, not trying to be everything to everybody type of technology, really can help so many aspects of American life that we don't traditionally think about. And I think that's the underlying part of what Foundation for the Future is like to talk a lot about, I think, is this is such a cliche, but rethinking the paradigm of what space is. And I think CubeCab isn't the multi-trillion-dollar company that wants to launch a satellite to completely redo GPS. It's about using inexpensive, quick technology to immediately help problems that will immediately see value. Things like Sabrina mentioned with natural disasters and storms and the like. And, you know, for another day of discussion, we can talk a little bit about how we can, we've published some of these issues on the website, how we can work with governments, friendly governments like Ukraine, like Cuba dissidents, to ensure that repressive regimes do not block out internet access, so that we can sort of within a day or two get up a small cluster of satellites and then restore at least at the minimum 3-4G type of technology, so that people can know that that the American people in the West is behind them and things like that, and allow them to communicate with their families. And there's a lot of really neat stuff that this type of technology can do. And sometimes as people who are participants in the space industry, we get a little bit frustrated because we know how much this would help, and it's tough that there's not broader buy-in from sort of the powers that be to sort of implement this type of effort.
Adrian has a question. If space-based solar power satellites were developed, might rapid launch be able to restore power, assuming a receiving antenna is in place or can be deployed quickly, as well as communications? As far as I'm concerned, yes. I'm sure it would take some components that may need to be repurposed to make this happen. Maybe the solar powered satellites could be pre-built and dishes could be placed in certain areas that are in high frequency to lose power communications. But yeah, I would think that that would be a good thing.
And I've had one more thing, and then Sabrina, if you want to sort of maybe say a word about this. I had touched earlier in the presentation briefly about the Orbits Act and how we sort of deal and mitigate these sort of events that satellites blow up and these things. CubeCab has a very neat little technology. I use little in quotes, but that is really designed to do some cool stuff with that. Do you want to say just a couple of quick words about the sort of Pac-Man that we're sort of working on?
So yes, we're currently working. I'm actually part of a 2-person team working on designing a CubeSat that will literally eat debris so that it grinds up the debris and uses it for IonQ, which I think is pretty amazing. Of course, it's only doing little things right now, but at some point in the future, it's going to get quite a bit bigger, I'm hoping. But yes, if a ASAT happens and a dust cloud comes up, these little satellites are going to be designed so that any debris that's under, that's 1 centimeter or smaller, which is not trackable by current ground-based satellite systems, we are going to be able to launch this thing right into the middle of this dust cloud and have it dissolve this stuff. I mean, grind it up, obviously, into this ion dust, which we will then use for propulsion to keep it going. So it's making its own fuel, which I think is pretty awesome. I'm working on the grinder end, and we've got someone else working on the ion end. But yes, it is a fascinating, the whole ways you can use debris. And I mean use. I don't mean just deorbit and throw that stuff away. Reusing that stuff is going to be pretty interesting, I think, and that's going to be a field for the future of space, I believe.
I think it's a great point, because I think the big mega chunks of metal and steel that break off are clear and they're obvious, and there's ways to deal with that. But like, there's going to be just unimaginable amounts of these minuscule little particles floating around, mucking up other satellites and getting in the way of GPS systems and things of that nature. So, we have to think, and this is why, for all the problems that the United States is having, and it's been having for a while, this is an example of the type of advantage that we have built into countries like Russia and China, is that a top-down, state-driven set of policy fixes are never going to be as good as the American innovative spirit. So it's not just CubeCab. I mean, I think we're doing great work, but there's tons of small companies, around the US and in Europe and Australia, interestingly Australia, and starting to come up a little bit in Africa and these things, where it's private sector innovation and entrepreneurialism that's finding problems that weren't necessarily so obvious. And I think that is something that if we have it there for us, we just need as a nation to come together and sort of, I think, do a better job of managing and utilizing that type of effort that we have done in the past when we were a different type of society.
I can see that. Yes.
You know, Sabrina, I hadn't heard of CubeCap before today, but I'm really excited about this. There are so many organizations out there that would love to have launches, but they have to, like you said on your website, they have to beg a ride from someone doing something bigger. This is going to open up
Exactly.
all these other projects that have wanted to do things and now can. It's going to be a major disruption. So bravo to you.
Mhm. Yeah. Another
Actually,
thing I love is,
Oh, God, yeah.
sorry.
No.
Another thing I love is being able to test out components for larger satellites, because you could test out a component on a 3U CubeSat very easily, have it space worthy, and then, you know, use it for other things. So there's this rapid launch thing is going to be a major breakthrough, I think.
So with this new ability, do you foresee the creation of new companies tailored towards this size of payload?
Hope so.
I hope so too. Yeah, I see a lot of people using it as this size payload, especially for like academic use. They're already using it for academic use to train people in satellite use before they get into using bigger satellites. So yeah, I think this is going to be a major breakthrough.
And not only that, and this is sort of what drew me to this type of company, is that they sort of want to be the satellite company of the people. The idea is a low cost type of offering, such as they have, makes it more palatable to things like community colleges, small hospitals. You know, imagine being a coalition of 3 or 4 community colleges in, you know, one city or one county, being able to pool their resources and develop their own satellite system that they can then use to teach space-based economics and space policy issues to their community colleges and students. Even develop maybe a technical program, like we have technical programs for auto repair or HVAC systems, you know, and this is a type of technology that would allow for that without, you know, having them to leverage their entire future, you know, to hire a more like traditional large payload type of satellite system. So it's neat
Well,
stuff.
it feels like a pathway to innovation that could be compared to like in-house manufacturing or in-house printing, and the way that changed a lot of companies. It didn't have to go out of house. So I think that's going to be fantastic. So we have time for one more question. I think we have a comment in the comment section. Sabrina, did you want to take it?
Yes, Adrian's, she said CubeCap's doing next business day launch, borrow a page from the software industry, launch and thereby test a new build each week to rapidly develop and space qualify some new component. Once a week sure beats 1.5 launch opportunity, 1 to 2 launch opportunities per year. Yes, that's kind of the basis of it. You know, he's definitely on the right track. We have, you could build something, launch it next week. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try this and launch again, you know, and with rapid launch, we can do that. And the technology's right on the cusp of doing that. We just need it to start working in that direction.
Fantastic. Well, Morgan, Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us today. Fantastic. I can't wait to see how much exponential growth we get out of this new business model.
Yep.
Thank
you.
Part of this new Zoom experience and Zoom culture that we're living is the fact that we're all sitting too much. So I want to encourage everybody to take a quick stretch break, stretch your muscles, get up and move around. And when we come back, Rachel Zisk will be taking over. I'm Inara Tabir. You can find me on all socials as the Galaxis Gal. It's been fun.
afternoon. I'm very excited to talk to some of our guests this afternoon about policy and media in the space industry. I work for an outlet called Payload Space, covering the business and policy of space, writing a daily morning newsletter for an audience of space professionals. And our first guest today, this afternoon, is going to be somebody that I know very well and work very closely with. It is the CEO and co-founder of Payload, Mo Islam. And so Mo today is going to talk to us a little bit about the Payload story and how we view the space industry from a media perspective. How's it going, Mo?
Good, and it's amazing to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, super excited to hear this presentation from you. I've seen a little bit of a sneak peek, but I'm excited to see the full story.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we kind of jump right into it, I just want to kind of introduce myself. So hi, everyone. My name is Mo Islam, co-founder of Payload, a digital media company covering the business and policy of the space industry. I started the business about officially 2 years ago, with my co-founder, Ari Lewis. I'm actually a banker by background. I actually spent the majority of my career at JP Morgan. I was on our private markets team. I was raising capital for growth equity and technology businesses. And I had a particular focus on frontier tech. So space was just one of my focus areas. And then I also spent a couple of years at Deutsche Bank doing effectively the same thing. And that's where Ari and I kind of came up with the idea for Payload, because we had a lot of, I personally had I was on the research side, and I was doing a lot of work around sort of business models and market sizing. And I just I felt like the most interesting businesses weren't being covered appropriately within sort of the media circles and the publications that were out there. And we just felt like we could create sort of a totally kind of different product, really taking on the successes of what we were seeing in sort of newsletter-centric business models, and we'll get into that a little bit. But today, really, I think the purpose of today is really, we want to share a presentation that I showcase to a lot of folks who are interested in space, smart folks who are like interested in space, but aren't really sure what it's all about, and would love some ideas and some feedback, and just keep it very conversational. And given that this is a space-focused audience, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of stuff in here that you already know. But really, I wanted to give you guys a sense of like how we think about the industry, where we think it's going to go, where we think the most interesting places are right now in terms of coverage, and kind of go from there. Does that work, Rachel?
That sounds great, Mo. And for the audience who's watching, if you have any questions over the course of this presentation, feel free to just drop them in the Zoom chat below or on the chat wherever you are watching these conversations. And we will be sure to get to those questions when we have a break in the presentation or at the end. And if you're in the Zoom at the end, you can always just turn on your camera and ask those questions then.
Perfect. Can you see my screen? Just want to make sure.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So just to provide everyone some quick context on who we are aiming to be the go-to media company for what we believe is the most important and fastest growing industry in the world. We're a newsletter first product. And what that means is, we live in a world where, or what we're trying to capture, I guess is what I would say, is we live in a world where most news is read on mobile. And with the proliferation of newsletters, especially the success of companies like Axios or Morning Brew, Axios built a $500 million business on a newsletter, and the sort of the concept of emails and smart brevity. And I think we started to realize that media and the consumption of news has changed significantly. And we've entered into an industry where there really wasn't a product like that out there. And for us, we also have to be, aware that the space industry grows at a very rapid pace. And the people that working in the industry, the employee makeup of the next decade will look very different from the last decade, especially from a cultural perspective. And that's one of the things that we want to tap into. And we think that those readers are not necessarily going to, pick the biggest or the incumbent media company around. They're going to go read the publications that cater to their style of news consumption. So we now operate multiple media properties, which include our flagship newsletter, which is daily. We went daily back in October, a podcast, and a whole host of new newsletters. One which actually Rachel just launched a couple weeks ago, which is Parallax, which is our science-focused newsletter, and we do have a policy-focused newsletter coming out later this year, so which we're very, very excited about. In terms of how we reach our audience, this is sort of the things I had mentioned, newsletters. We are starting to do a lot more events. We're going to be doing an event on the Hill this fall, but we do want to translate the Payload brand into an in-person experience. And there's different ways that we're thinking through that. By subscriber count, we're actually the second largest daily newsletter, but by actually engagement and open rate versus our competitors, we're actually the largest. We conservatively believe that we're going to triple these numbers by next spring, which we're very excited about, and we think it's very, very achievable. We reach a very key audience of decision makers. This is just a subset of our commercial reach. There's many more logos that we would love to include here, but the reality is we have been able to touch sort of every end of the commercial space industry. And here is just a selection of the type of policymakers and government officials that we can reach and have been reaching and will hopefully continue to reach. Most importantly, this is our brilliant team. So a lot of this does not happen because of Ari and I's idea. In addition to the two of us, Ryan Duffy was actually our first hire. He came from Morning Brew and is a newsletter guru. He was able to help grow their emerging tech vertical to 300,000 subscribers. So he knows about how to scale. Rachel, who obviously is here with us today, has been our brilliant journalist and obviously has a very strong science-focused background. And then Jess Liss, who is our director of operations, who now actually writes for editorial. She has a policy background, and she's been an amazing ad. So I think the best thing that we could have done is we hired smarter. And I think from that perspective, we're very, very proud of the team and everything that they've built. But today, I did want to spend some time talking about, how we think about the space industry, everything from just a brief history of the industry and how we see it, to what has happened, how we got here today, and this sort of enormous expansion of private capital, current macro tailwinds, and I think just interesting things about technology. And by the way, feel free to chime in. I'll try to check the chat box every so often just to see if there's any questions, but definitely feel free to chime in if there's something that you feel very passionate about or something you disagree with. I certainly don't think everything we say here is going to be something, and there might be a couple of things here that are controversial, so please don't hesitate to kind of jump in. So okay, so just to kind of kick things off, from our perspective, space really started with the V2. The V2 is a breakthrough in rocket technology developed during World War II in Nazi Germany by a scientist named Wernher von Braun. After the war, as we all know, there was a huge kind of coordinated effort between the, well, not coordinated, but coordinated within the US and then also within the Soviets to go into Germany and to see how many of the scientists that they can actually capture and bring back home. We were lucky enough to get von Braun. And of course, he was given the choice between, either facing war crimes or becoming part of the space program. And for him, obviously, it was an easy choice. But not to get into the politics of it, he ultimately did lead to a substantial amount of innovation and development of a lot of our rocket technology today, including the Saturn V, of course. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite into space, Sputnik. And the New York Times at the time had a very rare threefold headliner story about the Soviet successful launch, and it created mass paranoia and began this perception that the Soviets were creating this massive technology gap versus America, which is at the time true. Just a few years later, on April 12th, 1961, it was again the Soviets who sent the first person to space, so Yuri Gagarin. And then soon after, Mercury era astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American to reach space. And I think it was about a month. Later. It was also later that year, that JFK set sort of that national goal of landing a human on the moon within the decade. And we did it. The Apollo program was the third US human spaceflight program after Gemini and Mercury and Gemini. And it succeeded in landing the first human on the moon. And the Apollo program lasted between 1968 and 1972. And one thing that we actually do kind of monitor that we think is interesting is NASA budgets at the time of the Apollo program peaked around 4% of all US federal spend. That number sits at an order of magnitude lower, something like 0.4 to 0.5%. So obviously much different than it was back then. Now, we love to talk about this, but a lot of people don't know this, including folks that we've met in the space industry, that we had plans to go to Mars, right after the Apollo program, and I do think we could have done it. And von Braun, who who built the Saturn V in the 60s, talked about colonizing Mars, and we had a major failure of political leadership. I think that really started with the Nixon administration. We had plans to build a moon base in the 70s, land on Mars in 1981, and have a permanent base by 1988. And I think if we had the Apollo level political coordination that we saw, there was, I really do think we could have done it. And if you guys have never read Dr. Robert Zubrin, you really should, because he talks about this quite a bit, and he's very passionate. And he's written those two books, Case for Mars and Case for Space. So following that, I think we kind of enter the age of sort of orbiting infrastructure. The U.S. launches its first space station, Skylab, between 1973 and 1974, and the lab was really meant to really, I think it was supposed to last nearly a decade, and it did not last nearly that much time. It very quickly lost altitude and ultimately was a failure. And the technology it was very clear at the time, the technology was very inferior to the Russian Mir station, which was much more successful, and it was the station for the Soviets until, or Russia until about 2001. But the progress, the sort of positive outcome of all this is the progress between Skylab and Mir ultimately helped get us to the ISS, which was the largest ever global collaboration in science and engineering. US was the primary financial contributor, and it's been orbiting Earth basically since 1999, and it's been continuously inhabited by astronauts since 2000. But of course, the ISS is going to be doing a very significant gap in the Western world's ability to operate in space. And I think despite the retirement of the ISS, the US is committed to sending national astronauts to low Earth orbit. And that was codified by a 2020 congressional directive to sustain a human presence in low Earth orbit. And then the space shuttle was really meant to be a new era of space flight, world's largest first reusable spacecraft, launched like a rocket, landed like a glider, and its biggest contribution was the building of the space station. And ultimately, the shuttle just didn't work as planned. It was about a $50 billion ultimate bill, and the cost was a burden that was so large that clearly only nation states or a conglomerate of nation states could handle. And as a result, I think this really started to get folks thinking about sort of commercial participation. Just checking on the Q&A real quick. Okay, we're good. So it sort of brings us to today, which is sort of the why now. And to us, the why now is really it's two kind of key things, which is changes in policy and changes in cost. And COTS changes everything. And COTS, as you guys know, Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program. Previously NASA, NASA's practice, especially for human space flight, was to offer cost-plus contracts for building rockets and spacecraft, which met specific design requirements. There was little competition, very few incentives to keep costs down, and the giant kind of defense contractors were obviously happy to win contracts and keep Congress happy. But we're not going to talk about that. It's political. But you guys probably already very well aware of that. So, in the mid-2000s, NASA administrator at the time, Mike Griffin, began experimenting with a very new approach, which is instead of specifying dimensions or specifications for launch vehicles and crew capsules, NASA would just effectively tell firms what they wanted and what they were willing to pay, and plus some R&D. And I think that shift really opened the door for firms like SpaceX, and the Dragon cost NASA just $1.7 billion, which ultimately made it the cheapest crewed spacecraft ever developed. And NASA is now utilizing a similar approach with future moon missions and, of course, the development of the successor to the ISS. And then, of course, the other side, on the cost side, collapsing launch costs. We went from $55,000, $60,000 a kilogram on the shuttle era, so now down to anywhere between $2,500 to $5,000 on the Falcon Heavy. So reusability is, led to enormous kind of cost savings, which was one of the huge barriers to entry to economic business models. And of course, also the commoditization of satellite manufacturing, lower manufacturing costs have increased launch cadence. And the example I love to talk about is Landsat 8, which is an Earth observation satellite, cost something like $800 million to build back in 2015. And today, like a bunch of Super Dove satellites from Planet, which costs about $300,000 to each to build and launch, can effectively do very similar very similar image quality, right? So there has been this vast commoditization of satellite manufacturing that has helped and improved sort of the launch landscape. The other side of things is really this improvement in engineering practices, this first principles-based engineering. So really designing and engineering from the ground up, using first principles to kind of rethink standard industry practices. The other thing is it just improved incentive structure. The kind of fixed price versus cost plus model in NASA was never really, the cost plus model just did not really lead to innovation in the way that we wanted in terms of cost structures. And then companies are now obviously incentivized to drive costs down as much as possible because you're funding with private capital. There's also been this kind of standardization of launch configuration. SpaceX did this really well. They've effectively productized the Falcon 9, allowing for cheaper setups and repeated processes. Reusability, of course, we don't need to get into that. I think we all know what that is. And I think one thing here that we don't have, which is really this what this cost-driven flywheel does, which is that ultimately expensive launches lead to cost inflation of everything else. And when you have a launch that costs 10 million versus 100 million, there's a lot greater incentive to cut costs on your payload. Because even if there's an issue, a second launch is much cheaper. And order of magnitude lower costs of launch ultimately lead to significant decreases in payload costs. So obviously more launches will lead to even cheaper costs, which will lead to even cheaper payloads and a much more robust kind of space economy. And then I think the other thing I would notice is sort of the iterative nature of engineering. SpaceX completely changed the approach to risk. They take a very Silicon Valley approach where it's let's blow stuff up in public and it's okay. And I think this is really exemplified by a lot of these new space economies or companies, excuse me. So in this slide here, this is Firefly, and Firefly Aerospace launch company out of Cedar Park in Austin, Texas. They televised or streamed their very first launch, which no one does. No one televises their first launch, right? Because you're just so much could go on. Why would we? And it did go wrong. It did not go well. But I think this culture of building in public and being okay with building in public, space is hard. We all know that. That is a culture that has been embraced by investors, right? So that has been a big kind of shift in the approach to risk and innovation. Let me stop there. Any questions so far? I mean, we can certainly save it to the end, but any questions, any thoughts from anyone? Okay, I'll keep going. So what's happened on the macro side? So right now, their public markets are in disarray. We're interestingly though seeing significant outperformance of real world assets versus digital world assets. So real world effectively oil and gas, metals, mining, aerospace and defense versus the digital world assets of software, fintech, metaverse, crypto, effectively the millennial portfolio. And I think that outperformance is particularly stark within aerospace and defense. And you can see here that despite the carnage that we're seeing in markets, the aerospace and defense index is actually only down 2% year to date versus the S&P down 18% and the NASDAQ down 26%. And I think these numbers are actually slightly worse as of the last couple of days. But really, this kind of just goes to show what's happening in the industry as well, in the industry at large, in terms of the defense budgets, in terms of the space budgets, in terms of NASA budgets. And I will say, I think a lot of people look at this chart and very quickly say, okay, well, this is because of Ukraine, right? And clearly that is a large part of it. But I will say, we've spent a lot of time dissecting all of the quarterly earnings reports from all the from all the defense contractors and the broader aerospace and defense industry. And if you actually dig into the subverticals of all these companies, you'll see that one of the main areas where there's tremendous growth is all of the space divisions of these companies, right? So if you actually look under the hood, the growth is very, very clear. And then, I won't spend too much time on this. Russia-Ukraine conflict has accelerated this kind of global race for space dominance across launch services, spaceports, engine development. Russia supplied the RD-180 engines to a number of American companies, and they've effectively said no more. So a lot of onshoring of production. And of course, the space station has been an ongoing issue on the news in terms of collaboration and cooperation. And it's I think probably one thing that I think we all agree with here, which is that the space race is going to be the biggest technological contest of the decade. In the Soviet era, we had 2 space programs. We have 80 now today, and a vast majority of them are aiming to generate economic returns. China, we don't need to spend a lot of time here. Clearly, that they're spending a lot of time and capital on this, and it is a national priority. And they are going to be, something as sort of from at least from the U.S. and NASA side that we're going to have to continue paying very, very close attention to. But I think ultimately competition leads to better innovation, better growth, and ultimately it will be a really good thing for the industry. So these are just some challenges to the industry growth that we've noticed just by talking to companies and founders and different stakeholders. There's a lot of different challenges. We've just kind of named a few here. In the interest of time, I would just highlight 2 that I think are particularly interesting, which is that we find that a lot of companies are very focused on product, which is how it definitely should be. But up until the point, there is a point where marketing really starts to matter. And I think that a lot of founders try to take the Elon approach of, oh, let the product speak for itself. If we build a really, really good product, the customers will come. But we have found that to be not true. Talking to a lot of founders in different areas of like development in their technology, and getting customers is always an issue. The other side of things is like we ask everyone, what is your biggest challenge? And the biggest challenge still remains, like 9 out of 10 founders will say hiring the right talent. And you can't hire if people don't know you exist, right? So you might have the best product in the world or the best propulsion system, best whatever it may be. And if people don't know who you are, then it's still hard to hire. So hiring is another issue that we see a lot of companies facing. So these are just some areas of growth, industry kind of challenges, but I mean, all very, very achievable and nothing here that's existentially an issue. And then in terms of the opportunity, right? So here's how we kind of think about this. Some of this comes from a kind of a friend and partner to the organization, this gentleman named Anton Brevde, who's an investor at Prime Movers Lab. But in terms of categories of space technology, like this is how we think about it: space for Earth, space for space, and beyond Earth. Really, the vast majority of value creation is really happening in the space for Earth category. And we think over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that value creation and economic kind of value creation is going to start to kind of stretch into the space for space and then beyond Earth. The beyond Earth is really where you start to get into a little bit more science fiction. But there's a lot of things I would argue that that we have today that many would have considered science fiction 50 years ago, right? So it's exciting to see how this is all developing, and I think the reduction in cost is going to be the main driver of how quickly we can get to this sort of beyond Earth category. And then just to kind of tidy up things here, a few things that I would say, a few areas that we'd highlight on the technology side. We do think Starship's going to dramatically change the economic model of space. I think the industry and market is grossly underestimating the potential of Starship as a heavy lift launch vehicle, reusable heavy lift launch vehicle. In just 2 years, if you just look at the facts, right, in just 2 years, SpaceX went from concept and design to a near complete prototype, which has removed a lot of the major risks. And it's also reflective, again, of this remarkable level of iteration. The sheer capacity and cost reduction that this should bring to the market is going to change mass and design constraints for the industry. The speed in which the company has been retiring a lot of these programmatic risks is going to allow it to quickly move sort of to the next critical constraints, like deep space, life support, robotics, a human-focused lunar lander, Mars surface habitation, and quite frankly, if NASA doesn't do it, SpaceX will. And we still think, just talking to folks, like in terms of how they're modeling their own businesses, that they're just, no one's really ready for this coming shock and launch capacity. And either you'll have to adapt to what it can bring, or I think it will create issues for a lot of kind of stakeholders out there. I know this is something that has been talked about in sort of within this organization, which is orbital debris. It's one of the most obvious implications of the commercial growth is this kind of sheer growth of debris and proliferation through this kind of proliferation of these commercial business models. And I think that there's a lot of things that we can be doing to kind of fix this. And I know there are a lot of companies, great businesses that are trying to fix this. Our perspective is that the majority of change will not happen until there's regulation. And we don't think regulation is going to happen until there's some type of event. And hopefully it's not catastrophic, but we do think it's going to have to be some level conjunction event that happens in space that forces everyone to the table to actually come up with meaningful change. Otherwise, I think it'll be I think it will be particularly difficult for, I think, these business models to have like long-term longevity. And then our ability to map and monitor is improving, very similar to satellite communications within Earth observation. Within Earth observation, excuse me, this sort of dramatic increase in launch costs, decrease in launch costs and increase in cost performance have led to far better technology. And I would kind of echo the Landsat example that I had provided earlier. But we're really seeing the three key layers within Earth observation: acquisition, which is the part of the industry that is collecting the actual data; dissemination, which is right after the acquisition of the data. It has to be stored and it has to be processed, and there has to be a way to aggregate that data via platforms and marketplaces that people can access. And then, of course, probably the most important part of it is the intelligence layer, which is where analytics and insights are derived from raw imagery. And I think this is the most scalable layer of the EO operating stack, and it leads to more kind of interesting business models, like very SaaS-based kind of business models. On the right here, that's an optical image of the fall of Kabul, Afghanistan. I think that's a Maxar image. And then on the left, it's a SAR image, synthetic aperture radar of ExxonMobil's Singapore chemical plant. I believe that, oh no, one last slide. So orbiting infrastructure. So this is just talking about what we discussed earlier in terms of like what the US will need to do, which is they will need to figure out a replacement for the ISS. And there's multiple companies that are looking to do that. Axiom, which has a sole source contract with ISS to take over the ISS and eventually have the ISS detached from Axiom Station. You have Orbital Reef, backed by Blue Origin and Sierra Space, that has the addition of the Dream Chaser spacecraft to take humans and to take cargo. Up there, you have the NanoRacks and Lockheed Martin collaboration with Starlab. And of course, Northrop is also working on this. So many companies that are working on a future kind of orbiting infrastructure, but it is something that we certainly need. And with that, happy to take Q&A. I know we touched on the media side of things briefly, but always happy to dig in a little bit more if anyone has any questions about what we're building and what we're looking to achieve. But otherwise, appreciate everyone having me here.
Thank you so much, Mo. I love that presentation. I think it's such a great overview of kind of what's going on in the space industry and the big trends that are happening. While we wait here for people to drop questions in the chat. Oh, we've got one already, so I'll save my question for afterwards. Martina is asking, could you please elaborate on the impact of possible recession on the space economy?
Yeah, so I think what is happening right now, and look, I wouldn't even say, I mean, recession is definitely, like the R word is an issue. To me, the bigger issue, which is clearly related, they're not mutually exclusive, is what's happening with inflation and interest rates. Because the nature of what space is as a industry where it requires a lot of capital, capital becomes more expensive as interest rates go up. And I think that's one of the key hurdles, I think, in the near term from seeing, I mean, the last couple of years, we broke VC records in terms of like every year we broke it like by double, like how much capital was flowing into the space. Recession in general has less effect on, a industry where there's so much defense and government contracts and government backing. I mean, I'll tell you, just by nature of being in this industry on the media side, our ad business has not slowed down. Even, in fact, it's accelerated, even though it's a recession. I think it speaks to the nature of how the industry ultimately is backed in terms of capital formation. But the future, I think, of the industry is really going to be private sector. So there's a lot of companies that raised money over the last year, and I think they're going to have a really, really difficult time raising money again if they need it. And I think that's where you're going to either see significant decreases in valuation, or you're going to see companies that go out of business. And there's going to be companies with really, really great ideas that just will not be able to access capital because the fundamental equation from investors have changed. It's not about addressable market anymore. It's now about return on investment. It's about free cash flow. That's what investors care about now. That could change, but to me, the rate environment is making it very, very difficult for high growth industries like technology, like space, to really meaningfully grow from a private capital perspective. I mean, look, the industry has been around forever without private capital, without substantial venture capital. So it's not like the industry is not going to survive; it will. But the question is, like, in terms of like the pace and path of innovation, I do think that that's going to be really dependent on how much private capital that we can bring into the industry. So I think that if you look at the SPAC market, I think there's going to be a number of SPACs that are going to they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it, and that's just like literally a simple equation of like looking at how much cash they have on their balance sheet, look at that, how much money they're burning, and the fact that the capital markets are closed to them. And that's the challenge of going public. When you go public and you need to raise money, you raise follow-on capital from the public markets, and the public markets are very, very ruthless. If you say you're going to do something in terms of an estimate or a number, whether it's top line, bottom line, or it's a milestone, and you don't hit that milestone, you get crushed. And that's what's happened to a lot of these companies. So I think you're going to see either companies go out of business, you're going to see consolidation over the next couple of years, as there's a little bit more, I think people start to really think about what is the ROI on the investment? Is this company ever going to be profitable? Are they going to make money? Or is this like a really interesting science project?
Yeah. Mo, do you think that there are any types of business models or sectors in the space industry that might be a little bit more resilient to more restricted capital markets?
That's a great question. Anything that has a huge defense focus, anything where there's like active defense, like active military government customers today. So like, I mean, Earth observation, right? That's an easy one. Like if you produce imagery and data that the government needs, I think you'll be able to survive. I think that launch is going to be really tough because a lot of launch companies need a lot of capital, and governments aren't willing to put money on the table at those companies until they know they have a working product. So it just requires more capital to get to a working product. So a lot of these capex heavy businesses are gonna suffer. But yeah, I think anywhere where there's any type of like significant defense angle, I think that you're pretty safe, right? Really dual use technology. I do think that the space stations, to a degree, are going to be relatively safe. I think once like Tiangong is operational and it starts to really like be very clear to the American population and the government that, hey, we don't have a space station, like I think there's going to be a lot of congressional support behind building out orbiting infrastructure.
Yeah, the possibility of a handful of commercial space stations going to orbit in the next decade is a really exciting one. Could you talk a little bit more about what we kind of stand to gain from having these additional commercial space stations in orbit?
Yeah, so just taking the science side of things, right? Like so much of our ability to operate in deep space is like a lot of that testing is happening, like, what space's effects on organs and our health and our immunity, and like so many different things are being tested right now. And if you actually look, there was the Office of the Inspector General released a report on this, I want to say earlier this year. And they said that if ISS is in fact, actually not if, once the ISS is no longer operational, there's a number of very critical Mars-related science experiments and research that's happening that will be discontinued, right? And these are critical things that we are using to help determine if we can survive on a six-month journey to Mars and back, right? So it will have very, very significant implications for them. So from the science side, I think it will have implications from the perspective of like, just like global coordination, like, they're going to space is a point of national pride. And what you're seeing now is many governments that don't have the multiple billions of dollars to go and build a rocket and a launch pad and sort of do all that. They can now pay companies. There are companies out there where you can just pay and they will take you to space. They will take you to the ISS. And, instead of paying, billions of dollars to build a whole like launch system, you can pay and like train your astronauts, you can pay someone a fraction of that price, and they'll do it for you. They'll train your astronauts and they'll send them to space. And that sense of national pride is going to be really important. And if we don't have it, then someone else, another country is going to have it, and they're going to be able to develop and build those relationships, right? So from a relationship building, from a political perspective, it's super important. And then I think the last thing I'd say is like these changes in cost structure are going to lead to really interesting, innovative new business models that we can't even see today. Like, I don't know, like people talk about in-space manufacturing. I think there's a lot of people, kind of proponents and detractors of whether that's going to work, whether it's scalable, whatever it is. But the point is, if we don't have a system and way to do it and like actually test it and like see if it actually works at scale and have that orbiting infrastructure to be able to do that, then like, I mean, someone else will. If it's not us, someone else will. And I think we're going to follow behind technologically. So I think it's super critical for a lot of reasons, both commercially and both from a scientific perspective about like the future of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, please do just drop them in the top.
Yes,
Now,
feel free to ask whatever would be interesting. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I can always try.
Yeah, no, in the meantime, I do want to ask you a little bit about this. We say a lot, behind the scenes that space is at an inflection point, and that's why we do what we do. We write the news that we write about. With the advent of Starship, which you touched on briefly, there was somebody in a previous Conversations for the Future who referred to the introduction of Starship as the Starship singularity, how it's gonna change everything. It's gonna dramatically increase the amount of mass that we can send to orbit super quickly. And I wanted to ask you what you think about that as an implication on the broader space industry. What do you think Starship is going to change?
Yeah, so I think a couple things, right? So I've made that comment in the past, and people have said, okay, well, what if it doesn't? So like, what if Starship doesn't work? And I think the question I always ask people is, do you think SpaceX is going to be around in 10 years? And then I think the answer, most people, I think 99 out of 100 people, unless there's multiple people in this room that would disagree with that statement, would say yes, SpaceX will be around for the next 5 to 10 years. Well, if you actually look at SpaceX's business model, it's reliant upon Starlink. If Starlink does not work, the company, the launch business, SpaceX's launch business does not justify its $125 billion valuation. The reason why it's getting such a huge valuation is because of Starlink and what it could do for communication. And that's what the investors, at least for right or for wrong, that is what the investors are estimating and assuming. Starlink, the V1 of Starlink constellation is up in space right now. For V2, version 2 of Starlink to work, it's actually a much bigger satellite. Like the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy actually does not have the capacity to be able to put that system up into space. So Elon literally needs SpaceX and Starship. Elon needs Starship. If Starship is not operational, Starlink will not work, and then SpaceX will fail. So like it's that serious. I just saw a comment come through.
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah, so
I'll read it so that the people watching on stream can see it too. So Martina says, The Economist had an article claiming that SLS is too overpriced because the Congress pushed NASA to develop it. They were advising that the rocket part of Artemis should have been left to private companies to bring efficiencies and cost savings, and that NASA should focus on research and organizational parts of Artemis. Do you agree?
Yes, that's an easy one. And I'll elaborate that in a second. But just to kind of hit on your point, Rachel, before we move on. So like, so Starship, in my mind, if you believe SpaceX is a operational company in 5 to 10 years, Starship has to work. It has to work. If it doesn't, that Starlink is not Starlink. They cannot put up Starlink. And if they can't put up Starlink, then SpaceX does not have a viable business model. I mean, they can become a launch company, and that's it. And they'll never be able to fund deep space exploration. It'll never happen. There will be no investor money for that. So like, then you're talking about SpaceX at a 20 billion, probably like the launch business is probably like 20 billion. Like 15 to 20 billion, and it's probably, I don't even know if it's worth that today, but like, let's just assume. So the singularity that we talk about is really like, look, we've spent a lot of time on trying to figure out like how much the ultimate launch, the cost of launch can fall to. And, there's estimates out there like, $1,000 a kilogram all the way up to like $100 a kilogram, right? Versus what it is today, which is on average, it's much higher than that. What that does is, I think it completely changes how people think about mass and design within space. Like right now, it's all about like making something smaller. Like the JWST, right, as a great example. JWST was the James Webb Space Telescope, right, was so expensive. It didn't start off as expensive as it was. It was a fraction. When NASA originally did the design and like the conceptual work behind it, they had an estimate. I actually don't know what that estimate is off the top of my head, but what I do know is that the ultimate cost of it was like 10 times higher. And it's because every single time there was something that they needed to iterate on, they were like, okay, we need to make it smaller. Every time you make something smaller, it adds costs. Like just generally speaking, right? If you try to add something smaller, if you try to fit the same level of like processing power or capacity, whatever it is, like into a smaller area, it usually makes it more expensive. And then, you know, like complicated ways that the telescope has to fold and all these things, that just adds more and more costs. If you don't have to worry about that, if you're like, hey, we can just put up this big clunky thing and it's going to cost like 10 times cheaper than we ever had before, like that just changes how quickly we can go to market with technology, how quickly we can go to market with a product. And it just changes our ability to, in terms of what we put up in the space, right? I think the idea of like a space hotel, as crazy as it sounds, can become a reality if like the cost to bring that thing up there is like 10 times cheaper than any sort of like estimate out there right now. So I think that like, and by the way, like it's really funny if you actually look at like NASA press conferences around Artemis and like the lunar economy, like they always stop short of talking about like Starship. It's always like, because the problem is like, if you're NASA and you're like, oh, like Starship is great and amazing, then I think Congress raises their hand and say, hey, why did we give you all that money to build Artemis? Because Artemis is a $100 billion program. So did we just waste $100 billion? Like, so I think that's a dilemma that kind of NASA is facing, is like, they can't come out there and state, which is starting to look like very evident, which is like, this was a very expensive project. And it was I think it's a continuation of a bygone era of cost plus frameworking, where NASA budgets were very dependent upon jobs in certain areas of congressional districts, which obviously forced companies to operate inefficiently, which increased cost. And I think that we're really moving away from that. And I think Artemis is probably the last really big example of sort of this like era that really we're kind of leaving behind, which is exciting. But I mean, I want SLS to work. I'm rooting for SLS. I mean, it would be a disaster if it didn't. Really want SLS to work, but you know, the cost structure clearly is not something that's sustainable long term. So.
Yeah, it was interesting recently. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson came out in a speech and said that cost plus had been a plague on NASA, which was
interesting. I didn't even know that. That's really
it was a really a new perspective, or a new voice from the NASA administration that we haven't really seen before, and no one's ever come out publicly and said from within the agency. I'm curious also, Mo, I think the larger view of the space industry from the people who aren't, entrenched in it on a daily basis is still kind of this this image of wastefulness, kind of, that you were talking about with NASA, and the biggest stories are the space tourism stories and the billionaires playground in space stories. From a media perspective, how do you think about that perception, and do you think that that's something that's changing?
I think that was one of the industry challenges that we highlighted, which is like the mainstream audience's belief and view about space is that it's like a billionaire situation and it is wasteful. I do think that that's a big challenge the industry is still facing with the mainstream audience. Like, despite everything we talked about today, and even just talking about the Starship Singularity and how important it is to the industry and how it could totally change the world and the future of human civilization. Like, I was at a dinner a few months ago with a group of 10 of my friends, and they were all very senior, successful people in the tech industry, very well educated. And at some point, payload came up, and at some point, just what's happening in the industry came up, and we talked about Starship, and literally, and I kid you not, and it was still surprising to me to this day, no one knew what Starship was. They had no idea. They were like hearing that term for the first time. And this was a few months ago. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, we are still very early, even from like mainstream consumption and like an understanding of like of what's happening, you know, in the industry. Now, we are a B2B publication, right? We focus on industry folks, so they understand what's happening, and they, you know, we don't take, you know, we're not writing, we don't certainly write about like, you know, the billionaire space race. That's not something that we cover, and we certainly don't cover it at the cadence that mainstream media does. We are thinking very hard about how to, Rachel, as you know, like we're thinking very hard about what to do about the consumer mainstream audience and how to tap into that and kind of change that perception. We're not doing that yet, to be quite frank. I don't think any of the space industry, space-focused publications or media organizations are doing that. But I do think naturally it will change as people, like I do think like, you know, when we land the first woman, the first, you know, minority in space, when we come back to space in general, or the moon rather, it is going to be such a remarkable moment for all of us, and I think most importantly for the younger generation, because I think it's going to really start to showcase that, hey, if you study science, technology, engineering, math, you could be a part of this like really cool, innovative industry that's doing a lot. It is troubling sometimes when I talk to folks and they're like, hey, the space industry is a waste of time. Like, what are you doing? Like, why is there? And it's just like, hey, your ATM machine doesn't work without a satellite timing system, with like satellites, right? And the timing system that it provides. Like GPS has created trillions of dollars of value. Earth observation has led to so much of the climate data that we see today. And like, it just, it's the wrong things get the attention, and we want to change that. But, you know, I think it's going to take some time. Which is why also people always ask me like, well, do you think we ever need to go to Mars? It's a waste of time. I always say to them, hey, whatever cost it costs us to go to Mars, we will as a society earn that back multiple fold by what it's going to do for the younger generation and what it's going to lead people to feel, and how it's going to encourage how it's going to encourage folks that like, hey, like if you can be an explorer if you decide to go into science and math and engineering. And I think like that value creation and what it does for society is going to pay us back for whatever cost that Mars mission is going to cost us many fold. But anyway, Rachel, this is my long-winded way of saying like, I think it's still it's a problem that exists, and it's a hard one. It's going to take some time to solve.
Yeah, and it sounds like so much of the value that you get from, you know, ambitious space projects like this is stuff that's it's harder to quantify. You know, the excitement that you're bringing up in people, in younger people.
Yeah, that's right. I think SLS, I think Artemis will bring back some of that excitement. I really do. That's why I want SLS to be successful. Because if it's not successful, then everyone just gets to point their finger and say, hey, look at this. Like we spent all this money for nothing. Like what a waste of money, right? So like SLS has to be successful. It has to work. You know, fingers crossed, knock on wood, it will work, right? And then, you know, we're going to be back on the moon in a few years, and it's going to be very, very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. It is one of the pitfalls that's kind of inherent in the space industry too. Like you were mentioning with SpaceX and with Firefly, this kind of fail in public, you know, build in public.
Yeah, I think that's going to be common now. I think if you're a space company and you don't build in public, people are going to be like, what are you hiding? Right. So I think that's going to be more commonplace.
Yeah. Do you think that there have been problems in the way that space has been covered in the media because of that?
So I think the short answer is yes. Look, I think a lot of the folks that we would consider to be our competitors are very good, and they've done a phenomenal job. I think the problems arise really with mainstream media, when like publications and organizations that actually have no real space focus, and they took someone from like one beat and say, hey, you're covering space now. And they're like, oh, well, what do I cover? Obviously the sexy thing to cover is launch, and it's to cover like, you know, Elon or Branson or Bezos. Like that's the fun thing to cover, and they do that, and it just gives the wrong impression. So, but I do think that the industry focused media businesses do a really good job at like focusing on what's important.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a couple minutes left here in our time. Again, for our audience, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But from my end, I would love to just wrap up with a little bit more discussion about Payload and specifically about how what you think the value that Payload provides for the industry and how we've kind of been able to build a dedicated audience of 10,000 over the past year or so, 2 years.
Yeah, I think what it does is it provides, I mean, we still find a lot of people in the industry, especially the younger generation, who, like, when you list off some of the incumbent media organizations, that they're like, we don't know who that is. And you're like, you work for SpaceX, you work for Blue Origin, you work for whoever, and you don't know this company? And they're like, no. It's like, well, where do you get your news from? We're like, I don't know, we just, we Google it or whatever. And like, to us, I think that that's a very obvious place where we serve, where, like, the newer generation of folks entering the industry that want something that looks more like what they consume on a day-to-day basis. And that's where really the growth of the industry is coming. That's where the innovation is going to come over the next, for the future. And like, we think that our ability to attract that audience is, if we can just attract that audience and do a really good job with that audience, like, we've sort of done our part, right? And obviously we don't want to stop just there. But to us, it's like, how do we get folks that, like me, have not been reading about space, and they should be, to kind of focus on it. And our hope is that as the industry becomes more mainstream, which it will, we want, like, as things like Artemis and as things like Mars, and that starts to become more of a reality, and like there's more consumer interest in space. We hope that we've built something that's accessible, that people can read, that's fun, that's like feels like it's speaking to you, that you wake up every morning and, oh, I want to know what's happening in space, right? Like, create something that like is very engaging, right? And it's part of the reason why our engagement rate is so high. I mean, people always look at that number and say, how is that possible? That, like, over 50% of you have 50% engagement, and like, where the industry standard across most of these types of publications are like 20%. And I think it just goes to show that, like, we've built something that people actually really like and want to engage with every single day. And I think long term, once we think about more of a larger consumer audience, I think that's going to be really, really helpful in our ultimate goal, which is like, hey, like, space is really awesome. It's really cool. You need to know about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful way, I think, to wrap up the presentation. As a writer for Payload, it's something that's very exciting for me to write every day, and it's been great to see the response that we've gotten from the space industry.
And I will just say really quickly, just to plug Rachel here, like, she is amazing. She has been such a pleasure to work with and a huge value add to the company and the business. And she's now obviously building out our science-focused publication, and she's done a phenomenal job. So if you guys are readers of Payload and you like Payload, please sign up for Parallax, because it is a huge passion for her, and she does a phenomenal job with it. And we're very, very excited to see it grow.
Thank you, Mo. I appreciate that. I have already dropped links to subscribe to Payload and Parallax in the chat below. If
Great.
you have any other links or anything, any contact information that you want to share with the audience, you also—
Yeah, I'll just include my email. So anyone, if I can ever be helpful, if there's anything interesting or just want to talk about space, just feel free to email me. I'm always available and always happy to chat.
Thanks, Mo. It's been wonderful having you present today.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you guys for having me. Really appreciate it.
Okay, bye. And with that, we are going to transition to our next speaker. The next speaker is going to be a recorded interview with Robert Giovannetti. We have the privilege of showing a conversation between Colonel Robert Giovannetti and Tim Chrisman, recorded last week. Robert was introduced to us through our mutual friend, Joy Schaffler, who was on the Conversations for the Future stream yesterday. And we are so happy to have the opportunity to talk with him. Due to everyone's schedules, we had to pre-record the interview, but we thank Robert so much for taking the time to be a part of our event today. And I believe that Robert will be available after showing this pre-recorded interview for questions afterwards. So still keep track of your questions during the interview, ask them in the chat, and we will get around to them at the end. But by way of introduction, Colonel Robert Giovanetti is Director of Air Force CyberWorks, where he leads a cross-functional team of the best and brightest subject matter experts from the military, civil service, industry, and academia in accelerating innovation and transformation using cyber to increase multi-domain warfighter effectiveness. The CyberWorks team utilizes industry best practice tools and methodologies with 100% focus on user needs and experience. While facilitating discovery of the root problem and the ideation of potential solutions, the CyberWorks team continues to work with the user and sustaining organization to transition a minimum viable product for iteration and fielding. And with that, bear with me for 1 second while I queue up the video.
All right. Well, Bert, it's great to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Real happy to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So I'm excited to dig in and find out a little more about CyberWorks. We've had some people from MGM Works come on. We've talked with people from SpaceWorks. I've worked with SoftWorks. But CyberWorks is new to me, and so wanna learn more about what it is you guys are doing and where you came from.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll kind of start at the beginning. So the CyberWorks started in 2016, and so basically the decision was to put it at the Air Force Academy.
Okay.
And so the idea was to have an innovation hub that's here at the academy, that we can leverage a lot of, the academic resources and, PhD faculty here, and then also the cadets to try and solve really hard problems for the Air Force. And so that's how I think we're kind of different than a lot of the other innovation sort of cells and works, across the Air Force and Department of Defense. But then we take operational problems from Air Combat Command. So we're actually funded through Air Combat Command. And we really try to be that conduit. So we're taking, the challenging problems from the Air Force and the warfighter, and Space Force too, quite frankly. And then, these wicked problems that, just don't have easy things that are really complex. And we take those, we apply human-centered design, user experience, and futures and forecasting to kind of get with the initial users early in the innovation cycle, and try to, make sure that the problem's well defined, and then try to find a good way ahead. We try to just get to the sort of the prototype phase, and then we hand that off to other innovation partners there. So again, really focused on that user, which I think makes us unique, and then really trying to get that early phase so that we're solving the right problem, sort of getting after that, for the Department of the Air Force and then DoD. And so we have customers from all across. So
yeah. Well, and so for people not familiar with Air Force, and I guess this is military, more writ large sort of organization, Air Combat Command is the entity that owns all the aircraft. Is that right?
So not necessarily all the aircraft, but sort of the combat aircraft, from that perspective. So, we have Mobility Command that does more of the sort of the transport, and so we have other commands, but it is a major command in the Air Force.
Yeah.
And is really focused primarily on the fighter aircraft, but a lot of the other sort of mission support aircraft as well across the Air Force. And so again, having that sort of tie, again, we're not exclusive to them necessarily, but that is where Air Force Cyber is funded out of. And so that's kind of the tie too, we're not exclusive to cyber either. But we do find that a lot of these problems that we're dealing with have a real sort of information technology issues or problems. And so having that discipline tied in is really huge.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, I'm a huge nerd and grew up reading Popular Science and Popular Mechanics. Those were two of the magazines we always had. And watching the evolution of aircraft from fly-by-wire to, I mean, I don't even know what you're flying by now. There's some sort of magic in the box, but like all digital, I can only imagine the level of integration that you're looking forward to working on. So I can, yeah, makes total sense to integrate you there. Yeah. So what, you know, with CyberWorks, you said you were there at the Air Force Academy. Most of the other ones are not necessarily doing that. What is it that benefits you all by being co-located with the Air Force Academy?
No, it's a great question, Tim. So again, I think that the key piece is, you know, here at the Academy. So again, you know, Air Force focused, you know, we're putting out, you know, so there's 1,000 cadets that are coming into the Air Force. And so part of that is kind of an investment in, you know, innovation. And so that they're able to see some of that from that perspective. But then also, you know, the faculty, you know, we have a huge faculty piece that, you know, just, I think I already said, but maybe, I mean, so there's on the order of 140 PhDs here that are teaching that is somewhat of, you know, a lesser tapped sort of resource sometimes to be able to do that. And so, and you know, as part of the, you know, academic promotion from that point, they're doing research and they're focused on different things. So what better a way for us to bring in, you know, the actual operational problems the Air Force and Space Force are having, and basically try to bring that in and bring in the faculty and the cadets to be able to leverage them to help out and solve these where, you know, they would be doing other research, but it may not be on, you know, maybe something more long-term or it may be something less aligned. And so we try to bring those in and get that. And you know, also there's an inspiring piece too of working on something that's really relevant to people today to get after that. So I think that's been a great resource and something that we do that's a little bit different than a lot of the other, you know, works and other innovation sort of labs and cells.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, you know, this whole works network has been a really cool development over the past few years. I guess we're bordering on a decade. So it's definitely something, you know, while I was in the Army that would have been handy. We're constantly beating our heads up against the wall, trying to get new innovations fielded. And so it's really cool to see that current and future warfighters are getting that support.
Yeah, and actually, you know, you bring up a great point with the network piece, and I think that's, you know, I think, you know, something, you know, almost 10 years now, as you brought up, is really key. We've been trying to say, how do we innovate better? How do we get better ideas? How do we move this stuff in the military and in government sort of faster to get better solutions and those sorts of things? And I think the key piece of where we're at right now is we have a lot of these different pieces that are stood up, and now we need to integrate and sort of collaborate across the board, because I think that there's best practices in a lot of these different pieces. And so again, you know, as I mentioned, we're focused on innovation really up to prototype, but we need to be focused on getting that to implementation. And to do that successfully, we need to be handing off to our other innovation sort of partners and, you know, program offices and different MAGCOMs and different pieces, so that we can make sure that they're being acted upon and that we're giving them something that they can actually take with requirements, that sort of thing, to get to a solution. And we also work really heavily with industry. We have a partner intermediary agreement that we work pretty heavily. So, you know, we do these human-centered design sprints is one of the many things we do. And we bring in industry to help us solve these problems, just so we're not just bringing in the same sort of military people that have been staring at the problem, and we get that industry and technology focus that, you know, we can get that perspective and go, you know, I don't understand why you guys are trying to solve this problem. You know, industry's been doing this for 5 years and we do it, you know, completely different, and it's not nearly as big an issue. And so a lot of those pieces are really huge as well. And our partners there have been really, really key in terms of, you know, how we can get to solving things a little bit better. And that awareness and perspective has been absolutely huge.
Yeah, no, and that I think has been one of the best things that's come out of this, the last 2 decades of conflict in the Middle East, is this recognition that the military can't and shouldn't be doing everything. There's plenty of things that we can partner with industry, academia, to bring in new solutions. There's no need to spend 40 years developing a new aircraft, a new rifle. There's plenty of stuff off the shelf you can modify and rapidly innovate. And so I think what you're doing there on the cyber realm is a natural extension of that. So yeah, let's get into, you know, what is it that you guys are working on, and you know, specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, so we have a really sort of diverse portfolio of different things that basically, anyone in the Air Force, Space Force, we've helped some of the other services, but a little bit less so, just because we're funded by the Air Force. But so basically, anyone can kind of hit us up if they have a real wicked problem or whatever, and we'll look at it and try to figure out how we can help. And so one of the key areas there, though, that we use, so obviously, problems that are related to ACC because of our funding or cyber, or or benefits to the academy, those have a little bit higher weighting in terms of where we go, or if it's a technology area that we're really interested in, or that we think that there's opportunity for industry or tech transfer. And so those are great. So we kind of weigh that. We have sort of a process that we go through, and then we select projects from that. And so a couple of the different things that we're working right now is, so we're doing some talent management in cyber for officers and enlisted there. So one of the cooler ones was the B-52 ejection seat. It was basically an old system that was it's the seat that actually ejects down out of a B-52, which I think is unique. I don't think we have any other systems that do that. And basically, it was an antiquated design, and we were the Air Force Global Strike Command basically hit us up and said, we're spending a lot of money because we're having to replace individual components on this seat, and it was made in the 60s or 50s or whenever it was designed. And so they asked us to how can we redesign this quickly and do that. And so here at the academy, we were able to get some of the mechanical engineering, aeronautical engineering, and we also have our parachute team, Wings of Blue, all came together, and basically with the Air Force Global Strike Command, they have a strike works there. We came up here and did a prototype on a new design for it, and so got after that of accelerating that new design so they can give that to the program office and start with some of the requirements there. And so that was a good one there. Actually, right now we're looking at for the dean here, kind of relooking what is the future of unmanned aerial systems here at the academy.
Okay.
That's actually going on right now in one of our other sprint areas here. So that's pretty cool. I'll hit some of these other ones. It's really, really quick.
Okay.
But we're looking at Air Force aircrew scheduling and how that process is done. So, again, and that's actually a bigger issue across the Air Force, I would say, is, how do we schedule, resources together in sort of an optimized sort of fashion? What we found is a lot of those are done, it's essentially someone with real expert knowledge in a spreadsheet and, or maybe some sort of tool, but, we're not now really leveraging any sort of analytical, ideally, everyone wants to say, well, you need, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And, but I mean, honestly, just having some sort of analytical piece of that to actually manage resources and be able to sort of goal seek or, set some sort of optimized criteria to save money or do stuff like that.
Yeah.
So a lot of those processes are not really optimized. We're kind of looking at, we have several projects going in that area, but in this case with the aircrew scheduling, that was something that ACC and Kessel Run is another program up in Boston that has was leveraging some of our help there. Another one with scheduling was special warfare through our 2nd Air Force for their technical training. Again, those pipelines for special forces and those for on the Air Force side. As I think you're aware with your Army background, you have a lot of different schools that you have to go to to kind of get all that training and queuing those up in a way. And if you're not, if you burn a week or two, not only are you kind of wasting people's time, but there's money there to be able to do that. So that was another scheduling one that we've been involved with to help there. Just last week, we were helped out basically down in Montgomery, the conference down there to FIDIC. We did one of our design experts helped out the headquarters Air Force for 8-2 and 6, which is intelligence and our communications or cyber.
Oh, okay.
To look at basically at our communication squadrons, which are kind of our IT leads at all the bases. One of the problems that are doing there because that basically they have a lot of problems, which is not really a secret to anyone because it's been a challenge, I think, across the board because, IT is so expensive.
Yeah.
And how do you save money? And, it hasn't been a huge priority. We've been kind of maybe accepting some risk or whatever at some of those base levels. you know, how we do our IT systems and our IT support. And so kind of taking a deep dive at that of, you know, how do we, you know, sort of better resource, how do we do training, or how do we do some of that to get after some of the problems that they're seeing at the base level across the Air Force and Space Force. And yeah, so those are just some of the projects we have right now going on. But real exciting. And again, it's been huge with the industry piece, on helping on several of these, coming in and really getting expert people, that do this, you know, outside the military and getting a fresh perspective and other tools and other options that we hadn't considered.
Well, and I would imagine some of these would have applications outside the military, you know, maybe the air crew scheduling, anything you all develop, you know, maybe there's an airline that's not using some sort of tool like this that can then be shared, or expertise vice versa. So I imagine this has a lot of benefits outside just the military.
Absolutely. I think on the scheduling side, we probably benefit more from what the industry brings to us. Again, I mean, we're, you know, when we're trying to schedule resources on things, you know, that's a very common thing. And actually, you know, the airlines pioneered, you know, the operational research and those different pieces that, you know, we kind of benefit across the board. So, yeah, you know, I mean, that's a great example of, you know, they were way ahead. They were pioneering in that area. And how do we learn and do those things again, at our, you know, sort of price points, and how we can scale that across, you know, the Air Force is really key.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And I saw, you know, one of the other upcoming projects you had was looking at how do you fuse data for missile warning systems like the Next Gen. And I can only imagine, you know, if there's any student participation in this from the academy, how exciting that must be. To be, you know, a cadet able to look at these next gen systems and be like, I'm making a difference, literally in defending the entirety of the free world.
Absolutely. And you know what? I mean, honestly, like the perspective the cadets bring is really huge. And it's not just, you know, it's not just because they're young, and it's not just, you know, because, you know, they're motivated and everything. I honestly think a lot of that is because, you know, a lot of them are in it for the long haul. They're realizing that they're just beginning their career. And so if they can solve a problem now, they'll benefit from that and get that sort of thing. And so, you know, a lot of the older people like me, you know, it's like, if we solve the problem, then y'all benefit from it for, you know, maybe a few years or whatever, where they're looking at decades potentially of being able to get after that. So they really, you know, are invested in some of these different areas, especially, you know, in things like talent management. You know, I think that they, you know, where you're looking at, you know, how do we retain pilots? You know, how do we, you know, and those sorts of questions, those are areas that they're very, you know, are cyber officers in our sort of thing, but those are areas that they're really passionate in, and that they really bring a really good perspective on, that I think that, you know, a little bit older, you know, we get a little bit more, just in most things, you know, we get, more normed to the status quo or how it has been. And so, yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, oh, well, they're young and they have great ideas or whatever, but the reality and what we see in these sprints and with the perspective they bring is absolutely huge. And so it's great being here, and it's great working with them. We actually have several that are in the room, a couple down from me that are supporting the sprint on the unmanned aerial systems here at USAPA and what the future of that should be. And so it's been really cool.
No, I can imagine. And, you know, I remember more or less the only chance to influence retention and personnel management early in the 2000s was a survey that, if you were lucky, was sent around to the personnel officer in your unit, and he or she probably filled it out for the entire unit instead of actually going and doing a poll. But yeah, that would be incredibly motivating to be able to do that so early in your career. Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, and they have a full seat at the table, you know, and so most of our sprints we do, you know, we do it's in civilian clothes. So, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, so, you know, you want to try to remove some of the rank and different bias there, and do that. So a lot of times, you know, it's not even obvious, you know, at least outwardly, so that you can get those fresh perspectives and stuff. And you're not going, well, they're just, you know, whatever. And that, you know, that goes for all ranks across the board. So that's, I think, really helpful to tease out, you know, and you know, so that we're not getting that in where we just, you know, look to whoever's kind of been in the longest or the highest ranking at this table, and everybody just goes, oh, well, if they said it, then that's probably it. I'm not even going to wait, you know, And
Right,
so yeah,
right.
we really try to do that. So it's been great.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's cool. You know, in looking back across the different projects you all have finished or are ongoing, are there any that stand out that you're like, man, this was why we were created. This is the success that really makes a difference.
Yeah. So there's one that's really cool that we did fairly recently. So I think it started in 2019. So it's just been a couple of years ago. But we're partnered with Blue Horizons, which is a group out of our Air University down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. But basically, they came to us. It was kind of it started out as sort of a logistics problem. That was, you know, when the military moves into a different theater, we need different sort of basing or whatever we're doing, and you know, a lot of times in response to different things in the world, you know, we have to bring our stuff with us.
Yeah.
But a lot of that stuff can be procured locally.
Okay.
But that's a challenge because, you know, there's risk there and everything else. So what basically we teamed with the Blue Horizon Group and a bunch of different sort of entities there, and we got help from industry as well, was there's a lot of data, logistical data that's commercial. And so basically they developed an app to be able to tap into all that commercial data that's, you know, that's logistics based.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, if you know, we're flying a plane full of stuff somewhere, you know, if we don't think we can procure water, we bring water. That takes up a lot of space, especially places that are fairly warm, right? And so if you can procure that stuff locally, that frees up a lot of space on those planes. It saves a lot of money. You know, like, you know, with a lot of sort of logistics things. So this application was developed. It was called Bizant. And so they rapidly sort of developed it, got it together. And again, so it's pulling local commercial data globally. And so we were able to use that with, you know, in support of some of the different military movements we've had in Eastern Europe, and in response to some of the different things happening in Ukraine. And so they've been able to really streamline a lot of the different logistics things that we brought forward to support those forces into making better decisions to bring things that we need to bring and buy things locally that we that we can procure there. And so a pretty exciting project that we were lucky to kind of get a part of and be able to kind of help out and facilitate. And so something really we turned very quickly. And then we're able to have an impact with pretty close, you know, pretty quick time frame, and is being used today. So pretty exciting there.
Oh, I can, you know, there's got to be a huge cadre of logistics officers that are writing you Christmas cards and thank yous, because you know what was they'd go 2 or 3 weeks ahead of main bodies, and that was all they were doing, was just going out into the local economy and trying to figure out what's for sale, what's not, and then rush ordering stuff that they needed. That is a really cool project. And most of these are not things that if you asked, probably most of the people here watching, hey, what's a Air Force project that's really going to make a difference? They're going to be like, well, F-35, nuclear missiles, something like that. But at the end of the day, it's stuff like this that's going to save, a week of somebody's time, $1 million here, but do that for 50 years. That's really going to change how the Air Force functions and how they're able to operate. So this is cool.
I mean, the other piece there too is, that, instead of bringing, like I think water is a great example, that we've flown that in different places, right? Because you don't know, and, everybody needs water, but that frees up more space, on our actual logistics chain to bring more combat capability and personnel forward, that we otherwise need, that might take more time, whatever. And so I think there's a great sort of optimization component where, we're saving time, money, and whatever, but it also translates directly to combat capability and what we need to get to be able to, support whatever objectives there are in that area, whether it's humanitarian or, whatever that is. So really, really cool and super cool that we could be a part of that.
No, for sure. For sure. I know we're getting close to time, but, most of what you're doing is integrated or partnered with industry. And so, a lot of business and industry leaders are on here, are going to be watching. What kind of companies are you guys looking to partner with? That, what are the gaps that maybe these innovators and entrepreneurs can help fill?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, and what's really cool is it's somewhat open ended because you know, as we get in different you know, sort of different questions or different problems that people bring us.
Yeah.
You know, that we through our partner intermediary agreement, we basically do solicitations for industry to be able to come in and help out. And we typically, again, we have to down select a little bit on some of it because we have a lot of interest, which is super awesome.
Yeah.
And they come in and be part of, you know, these sprints that we do through that vehicle. And then, you know, we've been tied in pretty closely with some of the CIBR and STTR sort of vehicles. We have our own ability to do, you know, those and the commercial solution offering. So we're tied in that part. What I would say is we're seeing a lot of things sort of, you know, a lot of autonomous systems, and there's always a lot of, you know, scheduling has been a big area, but a lot of the technology stuff, you know, as we have customers or, you know, different pieces of the military come to us looking for problems to solve, we can go straight to industry and, you know, put out stuff to either answer questions, help us with, and then, you know, and translate that into, you know, a lot of it becomes, you know, sort of future requirements of, you know, what we need to do. And then, you know, that can go out and be competed for, you know, for different contract vehicles and different stuff that the Air Force, quite frankly, we need help with, and we need different pieces. So I think there's huge opportunity there, and the partnering with industry is just so huge for us.
Right.
And us as a means to be able to move to, you know, get things out in industry and bring that in to help on, you know, solutions for the military has been really awesome. And so, and we really appreciate their support and are excited in some of those different areas. But yeah, I honestly, it's pretty cool because, you know, I don't know on any given day, someone could come in and say, hey, you know, they need help with, you know, I don't know, anything from an injection seat to a jet engine to, you know, an unmanned vehicle to, I don't know, like creativity there. I feel like I don't have enough because I get surprised sort of every day. And then sure enough, we put it out and we end up with people here in the room that are, you know, real experts in things and that really teach us a lot. And then we're able to hopefully get that into the people who need it, and the Air Force get it in their hands to do. So really awesome. Cool there.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, thank you again for being here today, Bert. It was great hearing about what CyberWorks is doing, where you're going, and look forward to seeing some of these results coming up.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hopefully we can do this again sometime. I appreciate it, Tim. It was really cool.
Yep. Take care.
Awesome. Yep. Thanks.
All right, and we are back. It was a great conversation between Tim and Robert, who I believe are both now on the call to talk a little bit more and to answer any questions that you have. Tim and Bert, do you want to turn your cameras on and join the conversation here? Hello. All right, everybody's on. It was a really interesting conversation about innovation in the military. I'm curious, Bert, if you could talk a little bit about, you know, any specific innovations that are happening in the space domain. I know you focus mostly on the Air Force as part of this conversation, but I'm curious if you have anything else to add on the space side of things.
Yeah, so the space side, obviously with the Space Force standing up, so they have a whole myriad of different, you know, sort of talent management and a lot of process and sort of organizational things that are, you know, maybe not, you know, everyone wants to talk about rockets and spaceships and stuff in that space, but so there's plenty of that we've kind of helped with in some different venues. Also, Space Command and Control has been an area that we have some different discussions, and we're kind of at kind of an early stage in some of the projects associated with that, of how we can kind of facilitate. So those are kind of the areas we've worked there. We have several going there, but I think that's an area we definitely want to kind of help a little bit more. Again, we've had a myriad of just little kind of projects there, but we look to do some more different pieces there in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an exciting area. Tim, also welcome back to the stream.
Thanks, Rachel. It's good to be back.
Yeah, good to see you. I will hold here for one moment to see if we have any questions from our audience, please feel free to drop them in the chat as always. Or if you're in the Zoom call, feel free to turn on your camera and ask a question. But in the meantime, was there anything that you didn't really touch on in that conversation there, that any technologies that you're really excited about being able to bring to the military through SpaceWorks? CyberWorks.
Yeah,
sorry.
so no, that's a good question. So one of the areas that, just kind of going back and thinking, so there's a lot of focus and emphasis on, big data. And so a lot of different entities that have hit us up in that space. And obviously there's a lot of work there from getting your data and then facilitating that through to a lot of the different environments, platforms, technology, and then getting that to something that is, you can make decisions with. Whether that be AI tools or machine learning from that. So that's been an area that continues to come up that I really didn't touch on in there. And there's a myriad of different pieces that we need help that certainly industry has been helping us with. And I think we'll need to continue there. So that's an area that we didn't really talk to, but another big space for us for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are at the end of our time here. Unfortunately, our last speaker is sick today and won't be able to join us. But Tim, I think I'm going to pass it off to you to wrap it up here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Rachel. And it's great talking with you, Bert. Great having you on again. I think that the work you're doing there is really exciting and has entirely too many overlaps with what we're talking about in the space sector. And so, yeah, keep at it.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. And to everyone else, thanks for being here for another edition of Conversations for the Future. Thank you to our moderators, Rachel, Anara, Meredith. It's fantastic having you all on and driving the conversation and helping with the speakers. We really couldn't do this without you. And yeah, it's been a good event, and look forward to seeing you all next time. Take care.